Tonight, we begin a long-form journey through the history of the Second World War, a series designed to help you drift towards sleep and still come away with a clear understanding of how the world's most devastating conflict took shape. This channel is dedicated to that balance: steady, peaceful narration, paired with careful research and thoughtful storytelling. Each episode is written to guide you gently through the past, without rushing, without noise, and without the intensity that often comes with war documentaries. Just a calm voice, a quiet pace, and a story unfolding in your ears. Our journey starts here, at the moment the First World War came to an end. Tonight, we'll explore the final days of the Great War, the Treaty of Versailles, and the creation of the League of Nations. Decisions and ideals that were meant to secure peace, yet ultimately shaped the path toward another global conflict. I've spent many hours researching and crafting this narrative so it can carry you smoothly into the night, while still giving you a clear sense of how the world changed after the end of the First World War. If this gentle style of storytelling helps you rest, you're welcome to like the video. Please subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter. And if you'd like, share where you're listening from and what time of night you've joined us. I would love to know who has chosen to start this journey with me. Settle in, breathe deeply, and let's begin. The train eased to a halt as though reluctant to disturb the stillness of the forest. Its metal wheels sighed against the rails, and then everything settled into a hush so complete that even the mist seemed to pause. Dawn had only just begun to lift itself over the treetops. A pale, silvery light filtered through the oaks and beeches, softening their outlines until they looked like shapes from a half-remembered dream. It was 7 a.m. on November 8, 1918, a moment suspended between worlds, one war dying, another future already stirring in the shadows. Inside the rear carriage, once the private rail coach of Emperor Napoleon III, the green satin upholstery glimmered faintly in the dim light. It was a relic of a vanished age, a reminder of imperial grandeur now reduced to a backdrop for exhausted men who had come seeking an end to catastrophe. The German delegation sat quietly, their faces drawn, their clothes rumpled from the long journey. They did not know exactly where they had been brought. They only knew that this silent clearing in the woods marked the final stage of a grim pilgrimage. To them, this was the end of a nightmare road. And perhaps, if fortune allowed, the beginning of peace. A French officer appeared at the doorway, his uniform crisp in the cold morning air. He informed the 6 Germans that Marshal Ferdinand Foch would receive them at 9 o'clock. The words were polite, but the tone carried the weight of a victor addressing the defeated. The officer withdrew, leaving the delegation once again in the muted quiet of the forest. Matthias Erzberger, the civilian chosen to speak for Germany, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His stocky frame ached from the journey. His hat had been crushed somewhere along the way, and his glasses, lost in the chaos of the previous night, were still missing. He felt the dull throb of fatigue behind his eyes, the kind that comes not only from travel but from the burden of representing a nation on the brink of collapse. He thought back to the beginning of their trek, nearly 18 hours earlier, when they had departed from German Army headquarters in Spa. The memory came in fragments, the hurried preparations, the tension in the air, the sense that history was pressing in on all sides. Just outside Spa, the journey had nearly ended before it began. The car carrying Erzberger had failed to make a turn, skidding violently into a house. The vehicle behind them crashed into the wreckage, compounding the damage. Erzberger had been thrown about, bruised and shaken, but alive. The caravan, now shortened and battered, pushed onward. The roads had been scarred by months of retreat, deep ruts, fallen trees, the debris of a war that had consumed landscapes as easily as it consumed lives. The vehicles lurched and rattled over the broken ground. Fog drifted across the fields, clinging to the headlights and swallowing the world beyond a few paces. By the time they reached the designated point of passage into enemy territory, night had fallen. A thin drizzle blurred the outlines of everything, turning the world into a smear of gray. The lead car carried a bugler who stood on the running board, sounding short blasts into the darkness. Each note vanished almost instantly into the fog, as though the forest absorbed the sound before it could travel. At last, shapes emerged, French soldiers, lanterns in hand, stepping out of the mist like figures from another realm. They guided the Germans to a rail depot, where a waiting train carried them deeper into the woods of Compiègne. Now, in the quiet of the morning, Erzberger reflected on the strangeness of his role. He was a politician, not a soldier, a leader in Germany's moderate Catholic Centre Party, not a man accustomed to negotiating surrender terms. But the new government in Berlin, having loosened the grip of Kaiser Wilhelm II, did not fully trust the military to handle the task. The High Command, for its part, was eager to avoid the humiliation of carrying the white flag themselves. He remembered Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg's final words before he left Spa. "God go with you, and try to get the best you can for our country." The words lingered in his mind like a weight he could not set down. Outside, the forest remained still. The mist curled around the trees, drifting slowly, as though time itself had slowed to watch what would unfold. The air carried the faint scent of damp leaves and cold earth. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called once, then fell silent again. The minutes slipped by with the softness of falling snow. A little before 9, the Germans stepped out of their carriage. Duckboards had been laid across the ground to keep their boots from sinking into the damp soil. They followed the narrow path between the tracks, the boards creaking softly beneath their feet. Ahead stood another railcar, Focker's headquarters, a former dining car repurposed for the business of ending a world war. The forest seemed to hold its breath as they approached. They entered the car, and the door closed behind them with a muted thud. The air inside was warmer, but the atmosphere was no less tense. They waited in silence until at last, Marshal Ferdinand Foch appeared. He stood ramrod straight despite his 67 years, his expression carved from stone. Beside him was Admiral Rosslyn Wemyss of the British Royal Navy, calm and unreadable. Focker's voice, when he spoke, was cold and formal. "What brings these gentlemen here? What do you wish of me?" Erzberger explained that they had come to receive the Allied terms for an armistice. Focker's reply was sharp, almost cutting. "I have no proposals to make." A ripple of confusion passed through the German delegation. One of them asked how they should express themselves. Focker's answer was simple and final. "Do you ask for an armistice? If you do, I can acquaint you with the conditions under which it can be obtained." And so they asked. Silence settled over the room as an aide began to read the terms. Foch sat motionless, occasionally tugging at his mustache. Admiral Wemyss toyed with his monocle. The Germans listened, stunned, as the enormity of their defeat unfolded line by line. The forest outside remained quiet, unaware, or perhaps deeply aware, of the history being shaped within the walls of the railcar. The moment stretched on, heavy and unbroken. And the world, though it did not yet know it, was already shifting toward the next great storm. The terms were severe. Germany would have to withdraw from the territories it occupied, Belgium, Luxembourg, and large portions of France, without delay. Alsace and Lorraine, taken nearly half a century earlier, would be returned. Allied troops would cross into Germany to occupy the left bank of the Rhine, along with key bridgeheads on the opposite shore. The German fleet, once a symbol of national pride, would be sent to the British naval base at Scapa Flow to be interned. Then came the long list of equipment to be surrendered. Thousands of trains, freight cars, trucks, artillery pieces by the thousands, aircraft by the hundreds, machine guns in staggering numbers. The aide read each item with the same calm cadence, while the Germans listened in silence, their expressions tightening with every new demand. The only concession, if it could be called that, was the absence of any requirement to surrender the soldiers' personal rifles. Later, Marshal Foch would remark that the German troops had fought bravely, and that they could keep their weapons. But in the moment, the gesture felt small compared to the enormity of what was being taken. When the final clause was spoken, the room seemed to exhale. The aide lowered the papers, and the silence that followed was deep and absolute. Matthias Erzberger stepped forward. His voice low but steady, he asked for an immediate ceasefire. Germany, he explained, was unraveling. Revolution was spreading through the streets. The government feared that without a halt to the fighting, chaos would consume what remained of the country. Foch did not waver. There would be no ceasefire until the terms were accepted. Germany had 72 hours. With that, the meeting ended. The Germans stepped back into the cold morning air, the mist curling around them like a shroud. The forest felt unchanged, but the world they inhabited had shifted irrevocably. 3 days later, in the same railcar, at 5:20 in the morning, Matthias Erzberger signed the armistice. The ink dried quickly on the page, but the consequences would linger for years. In that moment, he believed he was helping to end the suffering of millions. He believed he was choosing the only path left to prevent further collapse. But the act would mark him in the eyes of many Germans as a traitor, a man who had bowed to humiliation. Within 3 years, he would be hunted down and killed by 2 former officers, men who saw themselves as patriots avenging a national disgrace. Their bullets ended his life, but the bitterness that fueled them would continue to spread, seeping into the political soil of a wounded nation. The harshness of the terms, the unyielding stance of Foch, and the violent fate that awaited Erzberger were not isolated events. They were early tremors of a deeper unrest, forces of resentment, pride, and wounded identity that would continue to build long after the guns fell silent. In the quiet of the forest, none of the men present could have fully grasped how the moment would echo through the decades to come. But history was already shifting beneath their feet. The 11th hour approached with a strange, weightless quiet. Along the vast line of trenches stretching from the Swiss border to the English Channel, soldiers waited in a kind of suspended reality. The mud, the wire, the shattered earth, everything looked the same as it had the day before, yet something in the air felt different. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath. Word had traveled slowly, carried by runners, whispered between dugouts, passed from officer to enlisted man. At 11 o'clock, the guns would stop. Not pause, not shift, stop. For men who had lived under the constant thunder of artillery, the idea felt almost unreal. The morning light was pale and cool. A thin mist clung to the ground, softening the jagged outlines of the trenches. Soldiers stood at listening posts, rifles slung loosely over their shoulders, unsure of what to do with their hands, their thoughts, their fear. Some stared at their watches. Others looked toward the horizon, waiting for a sound they had not heard in years: silence. When the moment finally arrived, it came without ceremony. One instant, the front was alive with the familiar roar of war. The next, the guns fell quiet. The sudden stillness washed over the landscape like a tide. It rolled across the trenches, over the shell-scarred fields, through the forests and ruined villages. It moved with a gentleness that felt almost impossible after so much violence. Men blinked, listening for the next barrage, expecting the thunder to return at any moment. But nothing came. A French officer later wrote that the silence stunned them. It felt dreamlike, as though the world had slipped into another dimension. Soldiers remained at their posts, unsure whether to trust what they were hearing. Habit kept them alert. Memory kept them wary. The war had conditioned them to expect danger in every lull. Even hours after the ceasefire took effect, many remained in their shelters, rifles within reach, eyes scanning the horizon. The trenches had shaped their instincts too deeply to let go in a single morning. The quiet deepened. It settled into the earth, into the broken walls, into the hearts of the men who had survived. Some felt relief. Others felt nothing at all. Only exhaustion so profound it dulled every emotion. A few wept quietly, not from joy or sorrow, but from the release of tension they had carried for years. The silence was not empty. It was full of memory, of loss, of the weight of everything that had come before. Far from the front, in the cities and towns untouched by the trenches, the reaction was entirely different. But here, along the line where millions had fought and fallen, the end of the war arrived not with celebration, but with a quiet so vast it seemed to swallow the world. The soldiers stood in that stillness, unsure of what came next. For the first time in more than 4 years, the guns were silent, and the silence felt louder than the war. While the front lines absorbed the quiet with disbelief, the cities far behind them awakened to a very different world. News of the ceasefire traveled quickly through telegraph wires, through hurried footsteps, through voices that rose with a mixture of relief and astonishment. In the great capitals of the Allied nations, the end of the war did not arrive as a whisper. It arrived as a surge. In London, the morning began with a sense of restrained anticipation. Parliament adjourned for a service of thanksgiving at St. Margaret's, the church that stood in the shadow of Westminster Abbey. The bells rang with a solemn clarity, their tones drifting over the rooftops and down the narrow streets. But the quiet reverence of the service could not contain the emotions building in the city. Soon, the restraint dissolved. Crowds poured into the streets. Clerks, soldiers on leave, factory workers, mothers with children in their arms. People embraced strangers as though greeting long-lost friends. Laughter echoed between the stone buildings. The city, which had endured years of air raids and rationing, seemed to exhale all at once. As the hours passed, the celebrations grew wilder. The boundaries of propriety blurred. People danced in the open, shouted from windows, kissed without hesitation. The joy was raw, unfiltered, almost desperate. A collective release after years of fear and loss. For many, it felt like reclaiming life itself. Across the Channel, Paris glowed with electric light and restless energy. By evening, a crowd of 20,000 gathered before the opera, its facade illuminated like a beacon. The great square pulsed with movement, flags waving, voices rising in song, the Marseillaise swelling from thousands of throats at once. The sound rolled through the boulevards, carried by the crisp November air. It was a song of triumph, but also of survival. Paris had lived through bombardments, shortages, and the constant threat of invasion. Now, for the first time in years, the city allowed itself to feel unguarded joy. People linked arms and swayed together. Others climbed onto lampposts or the steps of monuments, waving hats and scarves in the air. The night shimmered with light, music, and the warmth of bodies pressed together in celebration. Across the Atlantic, the United States greeted the news with its own burst of exuberance. Factory whistles shrieked across industrial towns, their piercing notes cutting through the morning like triumphant fanfare. Workers spilled into the streets, cheering, shouting, embracing. In cities large and small, crowds formed spontaneously, as though drawn by an invisible current. The sense of distance from the European battlefields did nothing to diminish the emotion. Families who had sent sons overseas felt a wave of relief so powerful it left some trembling. Others simply stood still, letting the noise wash over them, grateful that the long shadow of war was finally lifting. Far from the crowds, the leaders of the Allied nations marked the moment in their own ways. In London, Prime Minister David Lloyd George stepped out of 10 Downing Street before the appointed hour, unable to contain his excitement. He called out to passers-by that the war would end at 11, his voice bright with triumph. The words startled some, delighted others, and quickly spread through the nearby streets. In Washington, President Woodrow Wilson gave government workers the day off. He sat down to write a statement, his pen moving steadily across the page. He spoke of a world guided by justice, of nations working together to prevent future conflict. His tone was hopeful, almost pastoral, as though he believed the world stood at the threshold of a new moral era. In Paris, George Clemenceau addressed the Chamber of Deputies and the Senate, reading the terms of the armistice with a voice that carried both strength and weariness. When he finished, he wiped his eyes, stepped away from the podium, and left the hall quietly. He spent the afternoon alone in his garden, walking among the bare branches and fallen leaves, letting the enormity of the moment settle around him. The celebrations in the great cities were loud, jubilant, and unrestrained. But beneath the noise, beneath the music and the cheering, there was something deeper, a collective exhale from nations that had endured years of fear, sacrifice, and uncertainty. For a brief moment, the world allowed itself to believe that peace had truly arrived. And in that belief, people found the courage to celebrate as though the future would be kinder than the past. While crowds in the great capitals celebrated with unrestrained joy, a quieter set of moments unfolded in the lives of 3 men who would one day shape the course of the 20th century. Each received the news of the armistice in a different city, in a different mood, and in a different stage of life. Yet all 3 paused, if only for a moment, to absorb the meaning of the day. In Washington, Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Franklin D. Roosevelt stepped out into the streets with his wife, Eleanor. The city was alive with noise, whistles shrieking from factories, bells ringing from churches, voices rising in spontaneous cheers. Confetti drifted through the air like pale snow, catching the morning light as it fluttered down onto the crowds. Roosevelt moved among the people with an easy smile, his tall frame rising above many of those around him. He was not yet the figure history would remember, not yet the leader who would guide a nation through depression and war. But even now, there was a certain energy about him, a sense of curiosity, of engagement, of someone who enjoyed being close to the pulse of public feeling. He and Eleanor walked slowly, taking in the scene. They joined in the cheering, letting the noise wash over them. For a brief moment, the burdens of government work, the long nights spent coordinating naval logistics, the constant pressure of wartime decisions, all of it faded into the background. The city felt lighter, brighter, almost buoyant. It was a moment of release, and Roosevelt allowed himself to savor it. Across the Atlantic, in London, Winston Churchill, then Minister of Munitions, stood at the window of his office. From there, he could see Trafalgar Square beginning to fill with people. The great column of Admiral Nelson rose above the crowd, its base already surrounded by Londoners gathering wood, crates, and anything else that could be turned into a celebratory bonfire. Churchill watched in silence for a long moment. The war had consumed him, its strategy, its failures, its demands. He had known triumph and disgrace, had been praised and condemned, had fought tirelessly to keep Britain armed and supplied. Now, as he looked out over the swelling crowd, he felt a mixture of relief and contemplation. His wife, Clementine, joined him. Together they stepped out into the city, walking through the streets toward 10 Downing Street to pay their respects to Prime Minister Lloyd George. The air was crisp, the sky pale, and the city alive with a kind of joy that felt almost fragile after so many years of hardship. Churchill absorbed it quietly, storing the moment somewhere deep within himself. Farther south, in Milan, another man received the news in a very different setting. Benito Mussolini, editor of Illinois Popolo d'Italia, sat in his office surrounded by a small circle of admirers. They wore black uniforms, sharp, theatrical, designed to project strength. Mussolini himself had served briefly on the Italian front, though without distinction. Now he held court with the confidence of a man who sensed opportunity in the shifting political winds. The room buzzed with conversation. Italy had emerged from the war victorious, yet deeply dissatisfied. Many felt the nation had not been granted the rewards it deserved. Mussolini fed on that resentment, shaping it into rhetoric, into ambition, into a vision of power that would one day transform him from a newspaper editor into something far more dangerous. But on this day, he simply listened to the news, nodded thoughtfully, and allowed his followers to bask in the moment. The war was over. A new era was beginning, and Mussolini, ever attuned to the currents of public emotion, was already imagining how he might ride those currents to greater influence. In Russia, the armistice passed almost unnoticed. The country was consumed by civil war, white armies fighting to restore the old order, red forces battling to secure the revolution. The Bolshevik government, led by Vladimir Lenin, had already made a separate peace with Germany months earlier. The fighting that mattered now was internal, brutal, and unrelenting. Amid the chaos, a man named Iosif Dzugashvili, known to the world as Stalin, worked quietly in the background. Recently returned from exile, he served as Lenin's commissar responsible for overseeing the empire's many nationalities, an immense and volatile task. He moved through the machinery of the new government with a cold, methodical focus, tightening control where he could, watching for threats, shaping the early foundations of a system that would one day bear his imprint. For Russia, November 11th was just another day in a long, violent struggle. Across continents and political divides, the end of the war touched each of these men in different ways. Some celebrated, some reflected, some plotted, but all of them felt the shift in the world's direction, even if only faintly. The guns had fallen silent. The old order was collapsing, and the future, still uncertain, still unformed, was already gathering momentum in the lives of those who would one day define it. If you'd like, I can continue with Section 8 in the same tone, or adjust the pacing or atmospheric density to match your preferred rhythm for the full documentary. The news reached the military hospital in Pacewalk not with fanfare or celebration, but with a trembling voice. A chaplain, overwhelmed by the weight of the moment, moved from ward to ward, his words catching in his throat as he told the wounded that the fighting had ended. His eyes were red, his breath unsteady. The war that had consumed Europe for more than 4 years was over. The hospital itself was quiet, its long corridors filled with the soft echo of footsteps and the faint scent of antiseptic. Outside, the November air pressed against the windows, grey and heavy. Inside, men lay in rows of narrow beds, some bandaged, some blinded, some too weak to lift their heads. The building felt suspended between exhaustion and disbelief. Among the patients was a corporal recovering from a gas attack suffered on the Belgian front only weeks earlier. His vision was still blurred, his eyes painfully sensitive to light. He had been half blind when they carried him from the battlefield, and the world around him remained a haze of shapes and shadows. His name was Adolf Hitler. When the chaplain delivered the news, something inside him seemed to fracture. The words did not feel real at first. They drifted through the room like distant echoes, muffled by the fog of injury and fatigue. But as the meaning settled in, it struck with the force of a physical blow. He rose unsteadily from his bed, groping his way down the corridor until he reached his cot again. The world around him blurred further, not from the gas that had damaged his eyes, but from the surge of emotion that overwhelmed him. He collapsed onto the thin mattress, burying his face in the blanket and pillow, trying to shut out the reality pressing in from all sides. For him, the war had been more than a conflict. It had been a purpose, a structure, a belief that sacrifice would lead to something greater. Now, in the dim light of the hospital ward, that belief crumbled. He felt as though everything, every hardship, every wound, every friend lost, had been rendered meaningless. The armistice, he would later say, was the greatest betrayal of the century. Around him, the ward remained quiet. Some soldiers stared at the ceiling, their expressions blank. Others turned away, unable to process the news. A few wept softly, their tears falling silently onto their blankets. The chaplain moved on, his voice fading down the hallway. The hospital seemed to absorb the grief, the confusion, the hollow ache of men who had given everything only to learn that the world they fought for no longer existed. Outside, the town of Pacewalk went about its day with muted steps. There were no crowds in the streets, no cheering, no celebration. Germany was too exhausted, too fractured, too uncertain of what came next. Inside the ward, the young corporal lay motionless, his thoughts spiraling into darkness. The war had ended, but for him, something far more dangerous had begun. a sense of betrayal that would harden into fury, a wound that would never heal, a conviction that would one day reshape the world in catastrophic ways. But in that moment, he was simply a wounded soldier in a quiet hospital, grieving the collapse of everything he believed in. The silence around him deepened, settling like a shadow across the room. And the future, still unseen, waited patiently beyond the walls. The armistice brought silence to the front, but it did not erase the scars the war had carved into Europe. As the guns fell quiet, the true scale of the devastation began to emerge, slowly at first, like a distant shape coming into focus, and then all at once, overwhelming in its enormity. Across the continent, nations counted their dead. France mourned more than 1 million lives. Germany grieved nearly 2 million. The British Empire had lost close to 1 million of its own. Italy's toll reached hundreds of thousands. And in Russia, still bleeding from revolution and civil war, the numbers were beyond calculation. These were not just statistics. They were sons, fathers, brothers, friends. Entire villages had been emptied of young men. Families carried absences that would never be filled. The war had reshaped the demographic landscape of Europe, leaving behind a generation marked by loss. The old empires that had once dominated the continent were gone. The Hohenzollerns of Prussia had fallen. The Habsburgs of Austria had collapsed. The Romanovs of Russia had been swept away. The Ottoman Empire, ancient and vast, lay in ruins. The political map of Europe had been shattered, its pieces scattered across a landscape of uncertainty. On the ground, the physical world bore its own wounds. The trenches, those long, jagged scars carved into the earth, stretched for hundreds of miles. They were filled with mud, water, and the remnants of years of fighting. Soldiers had lived in them through rain and frost, through bombardments and gas attacks, through nights so dark they could not see their own hands. The conditions had been so brutal that even propaganda leaflets, meant to dissuade American troops from entering the war, described them with grim honesty. To imagine trench life, the leaflet suggested, one should dig a shoulder-deep ditch in the garden, fill it halfway with water, climb in, and stay there for days without food, while someone fired revolvers and machine guns overhead. It was an attempt at persuasion, but it captured a truth the soldiers already knew. The trenches were a world of their own, a place where time stretched and blurred, where survival depended on instinct, luck, and endurance. For years, neither side had gained more than a few miles. The front had been a vast stalemate, broken only in the final months of 1918 when the exhausted German army finally began to collapse. Even after the fighting stopped, suffering continued. The treasuries of the warring nations were empty. Economies were strained to the breaking point. And as if the war had not inflicted enough misery, an influenza pandemic swept across the world, claiming millions more lives. Hospitals overflowed. Streets fell quiet. Families who had survived the war now faced a new, invisible threat. And in Germany, the situation was especially dire. The Allied blockade remained in place even after the armistice, preventing food from reaching the ports. Malnutrition spread through cities and villages. People survived on whatever they could find: pine cones, nettles, chestnut flour, coffee substitutes made from acorns. Hunger gnawed at the population, weakening bodies already worn down by years of hardship. Farther east, famine loomed even larger. Entire regions faced starvation. The collapse of empires, the chaos of revolution, and the dislocation of millions created a humanitarian crisis that stretched across borders. In the midst of this suffering, emotions simmered beneath the surface: bitterness, anger, humiliation, fear. These feelings were not confined to one nation. They existed on both sides of the former front lines, carried by soldiers returning home, by families grieving their losses, by governments struggling to rebuild. Yet on Armistice Day itself, few could imagine that these emotions would linger, deepen, and eventually help ignite another global conflict. The hope for a lasting peace was strong. The desire to believe in a better future was powerful. But beneath that hope, the seeds of future turmoil were already taking root. The war had ended. The suffering had not. And the world, though desperate for calm, was entering a fragile and uncertain new era. In the days following the armistice, a strange mixture of exhaustion and hope drifted across Europe like a soft, unsteady breeze. The guns had fallen silent, but the echoes of war still lingered in the minds of millions. Cities were scarred, families were grieving, and nations were struggling to understand what the future might hold. Yet beneath all the sorrow, a fragile optimism began to take shape. People wanted to believe that the suffering had meant something, that the world could now be rebuilt on firmer, kinder foundations. The idea of a new era, free from the cycles of conflict that had defined the old world, took hold in hearts across continents. It was a hope born not from certainty, but from longing. For many, the end of the war felt like a doorway opening. Two powerful visions emerged in this moment of possibility, each offering a different path forward. They came from opposite ends of the political spectrum, yet both carried a kind of messianic energy, grand promises of transformation, sweeping ideas about how humanity might reshape itself after the devastation. One vision rose from the east. In Russia, the Bolshevik Revolution was still young, still fragile, still fighting for survival. Vladimir Lenin spoke of a world remade through class struggle, a world in which workers would rise above the old hierarchies and build a society free from exploitation. His message spread far beyond Russia's borders, carried by pamphlets, speeches, and the restless imagination of people who had lost faith in the old order. To some, Lenin's call for global revolution sounded like liberation. To others, it sounded like chaos. But no one could ignore it. The idea that the war had exposed the failures of monarchies, empires, and capitalist elites resonated deeply with those who had suffered most. In the ruins of Europe, where hunger and unemployment were widespread, the promise of a radically different world held undeniable appeal. The second vision came from across the Atlantic. President Woodrow Wilson, speaking with the calm conviction of a scholar-statesman, offered a different kind of transformation. He imagined a world governed not by conquest or revenge, but by cooperation and fairness. His speeches spoke of transparency, of nations working together, of people choosing their own destinies. He believed that peace could be built through reason and moral principle. Wilson's ideas captured the imagination of millions. He spoke of a world where diplomacy replaced violence, where justice replaced domination, where nations large and small could coexist without fear. For many, especially in the war-weary democracies of the West, his vision felt like a lifeline, a way to ensure that the horrors of the past 4 years would never be repeated. These two visions, Lenin's revolutionary upheaval and Wilson's idealistic internationalism, moved through the post-war world like twin currents. They did not simply coexist. They competed, collided, and shaped the political atmosphere of the time. Lenin offered a future forged through struggle. Wilson offered a future shaped through cooperation. Both promised renewal, meaning, and that the sacrifices of the war could lead to something greater. And yet, beneath these grand ideas, the world remained fragile. Nations were exhausted. Their economies were broken. Societies were divided. The hope for a better future was real, but so were the forces of resentment, fear, and instability. The post-war moment was a crossroads, quiet, uncertain, full of possibility. People looked toward the horizon, searching for signs of what would come next. And in that searching, the seeds of the next era were already beginning to take root. In the months before the war ended, as the world staggered beneath the weight of its own destruction, a different kind of voice began to rise above the noise. It did not come from the trenches or the battlefields. It came from across the Atlantic, from a professor-turned-president who believed that ideas, if spoken clearly enough, could reshape the future. Woodrow Wilson had spent much of the war thinking not only about how to end the conflict, but about what should follow. He imagined a peace built on principles rather than punishment, on cooperation rather than conquest. And in January of 1918, he presented those ideas to Congress in a speech that would echo far beyond the chamber where it was delivered. He called them the 14 points. They were not simply diplomatic proposals. They were a vision, a blueprint for a world that might rise from the ruins of the old one. The first of Wilson's principles called for transparency. No more secret treaties whispered in back rooms. No more hidden agreements that bound nations to wars their people barely understood. He wanted diplomacy conducted openly, with the world able to see and judge the decisions made in its name. Another point called for the reduction of armaments. Not total disarmament, but a lowering of weapons to the minimum needed for domestic safety. Wilson believed that the arms race of the early 20th century had helped push Europe toward catastrophe. If nations could step back from the brink, perhaps they could avoid repeating the same mistakes. He spoke of free trade, of removing barriers that had long divided economies. He spoke of fairness in colonial matters, insisting that the interests of indigenous peoples should carry equal weight with those of the imperial powers who governed them. And he spoke of self-determination, a phrase that would become one of the most powerful and contested ideas of the century. People, he argued, should not be shuffled between empires like pieces on a chessboard. They should have the right to choose their own governments, to draw their own borders where possible, to shape their own destinies. It was a radical idea in a world still dominated by empires. But the point that mattered most to Wilson, the one he believed could hold all the others together, was the final one. A League of Nations. A permanent body where nations could meet, speak, negotiate, and resolve disputes before they spiraled into violence. A place where collective security would replace the fragile balance of power that had failed so catastrophically in 1914. Wilson saw the League as the cornerstone of a new international order, a safeguard against future wars. To him, it was not merely a diplomatic tool. It was a moral necessity. When Germany finally sought an armistice in October 1918, it did not turn first to Britain or France. It turned to Wilson. His 14 points had captured the imagination of people across the world, victors and vanquished alike. They offered a peace that felt principled, humane, and forward-looking. Through a series of formal exchanges sent across the Atlantic, Wilson made it clear that the armistice would be negotiated under Allied authority, but that his principles would guide the process. It was he who informed Germany that Marshal Foch would receive their delegation. In that moment, Wilson's influence reached its peak. He had become, in the eyes of many, the moral compass of the post-war world. The 14 points were not perfect. They were idealistic, sometimes vague, sometimes difficult to apply to the tangled realities of Europe's borders and rivalries. But they carried a sense of hope that the world desperately needed. They suggested that peace could be something more than the absence of war. It could be a structure, a promise, a shared commitment to fairness. And for a brief moment, as nations looked toward the future with weary eyes, Wilson's vision seemed like a path toward a gentler world. A world that might finally learn from its own suffering. In the quiet weeks that followed the armistice, Woodrow Wilson found himself standing in a place few leaders ever occupy. A place where the world seemed to lean toward him with admiration, while the ground beneath his own feet at home shifted in ways he could not fully control. It was a strange duality, almost dreamlike in its contrast. Across oceans, his name carried the weight of hope. In the United States, the political winds were turning colder, sharper, and less forgiving. For those who watched him closely, the contrast was jarring. One moment, foreign crowds were lifting his ideals as if they were lanterns guiding the world out of darkness. The next, American newspapers and political rivals were reminding him that admiration abroad could not erase the realities of domestic politics. Even those who loved him, or believed in his vision, struggled to reconcile the two worlds he now inhabited. And so, as winter settled over the country, Wilson's prestige rose like a distant star, bright, steady, and admired from afar, while his influence at home began to dim. The glow of international praise could not soften what had already happened in the United States. Just days before the armistice, Wilson had made a decision that would shadow everything that followed. Against the counsel of friends, advisors, and political allies, he had stepped directly into the midterm elections, urging voters to keep Congress in Democratic hands so he could shape the peace without interference. It was a bold appeal, delivered at a moment when the nation was still at war, and many believed the president should remain above partisan struggle. The gamble did not pay off. When the ballots were counted, Republicans emerged with control of both the House and the Senate. It was not a dramatic upheaval, but it was decisive enough to send a clear message. Even a president celebrated across the world could not escape the ebb and flow of American political life. Wilson did not attempt to repair the breach. He did not extend a hand to Republican leaders. He did not widen his circle or soften his approach. Instead, he moved forward with the same unwavering determination that had carried him through the war years. He believed the peace required a steady hand, and he was unwilling to dilute that conviction by sharing authority with those who did not share his vision. When the moment arrived to select the American delegation for the peace conference in Paris, Wilson chose only one Republican among the 5 official members. The decision puzzled some observers and angered others. It deepened the impression that he was withdrawing into a smaller and smaller circle, trusting only those who aligned with him completely. For many, it was a sign that he was preparing to face the world stage alone, without the political coalition that might have steadied him at home. Yet beyond America's shores, none of this seemed to matter. Wilson's reputation abroad had grown into something unprecedented. He was no longer seen merely as the president of a powerful nation. He had become, in the eyes of millions, a moral figure, someone who spoke of justice, fairness, and a new world order with a clarity that resonated across borders and languages. His speeches had reached soldiers in muddy trenches, civilians in devastated towns, and leaders in capitals from London to Rome. They had carried the promise of a world rebuilt on principles rather than vengeance. To many, he was not just a statesman. He was a symbol of possibility. But the man behind the symbol was more complicated. Wilson was brilliant, principled, and intensely private. His intellect could be formidable, even intimidating. His formality created distance, sometimes unintentionally, even from those who admired him. He had spent much of his life in academia, lecturing on government, shaping young minds, guiding Princeton University as its president. Students remembered him as warm, humorous, even playful. Yet in the political arena, he often appeared austere, reserved, and unyielding. Within him lived a tension between soaring idealism and a deep reluctance to compromise. It was a combination that inspired many and frustrated just as many others. Despite the political risks, Wilson was determined to travel to Paris in person. No sitting American president had ever left the country while in office. His predecessor, William Howard Taft, had avoided even brief trips to Canada. But Wilson felt a moral obligation. He had sent American soldiers across the ocean to fight and die. Now he believed he must cross that same ocean to ensure their sacrifice led to a peace worthy of their courage. Advisors warned him that leaving the country would weaken his influence at home. They warned him that his presence in Paris might complicate delicate negotiations. They warned him that the presidency itself could be diminished by such a journey. Wilson listened, and then he went. He believed the moment demanded it. He believed history demanded it. He believed he alone could guide the peace toward justice. And so, even as his political foundation in Washington began to crumble, Wilson prepared to step onto the world stage with a sense of purpose unmatched by any American president before him. The contrast between his vulnerability at home and his prestige abroad created a tension that would shape every decision he made in the months ahead. He was admired across continents, challenged in his own capital, and driven by a conviction that the future of the world depended on the choices he was about to make. The stage was set. The world was waiting, and Wilson, with all his brilliance, all his flaws, all his hopes, was ready to step forward. In early December of 1918, as winter settled gently across the Atlantic coast, President Woodrow Wilson prepared for a journey no American leader had ever undertaken. The war had ended only weeks earlier, and the world was still trembling from the shock of its own transformation. Yet Wilson felt compelled to cross the ocean, not as a conqueror, not as a diplomat in the traditional sense, but as a guardian of the peace he hoped to shape. The docks in New York were cold that morning. A thin wind swept across the harbor, carrying the scent of salt and coal smoke. The ship waiting for him, the George Washington, had once been a German liner, seized during the war and repurposed as a troop transport. Now it would carry the president, his advisors, and the weight of global expectation toward the peace conference in Paris. Wilson stepped aboard with a quiet determination. He believed this voyage was his duty. He believed history had placed a responsibility upon him that he could not ignore. The ship's departure drew crowds to the waterfront. People waved flags, shouted farewells, and watched as the vessel slowly pulled away from the pier. The engines rumbled beneath the deck, sending vibrations through the hull. The skyline of New York receded into the mist, its towers fading like distant memories. On board, The atmosphere was a mixture of anticipation and solemnity. Wilson traveled with a large entourage, advisors, diplomats, military officers, and a remarkable group of scholars known collectively as the Inquiry. They were geographers, historians, economists, ethnologists, and legal experts, assembled to provide the president with the knowledge he would need to redraw the map of a shattered world. Their task was immense. Their presence signaled the scale of what lay ahead. Among them, the mood was studious. Papers rustled. Maps were unrolled. Discussions drifted through the corridors like low murmurs. Yet even these experts, trained to analyze the complexities of nations and borders, understood that the peace Wilson envisioned would require more than technical skill. It would require moral clarity and the ability to persuade others to share it. During the voyage, the Atlantic was calm. Days passed in a slow rhythm, marked by meals, meetings, and long stretches of contemplation. The ship cut through the water with steady grace, leaving a white wake that stretched endlessly behind it. At one point, Wilson gathered the Inquiry in a quiet room aboard the ship. They expected to brief him, to present their findings, to offer guidance. Instead, he spoke to them. He told them that the American delegation would be the only one arriving in Paris without territorial ambitions, without old grievances to settle, without empires to defend. He believed that the United States, untouched by invasion and strengthened by its late entry into the war, had a unique role to play. He said that the world was poisoned by fear, fear of revolution, fear of instability, fear of repeating the past. The Bolshevik uprising in Russia had sent tremors through Europe, and Wilson believed that only a just and principled peace could counter the appeal of radical upheaval. "We must help cleanse the world," he told them. "Agreeably if we can, disagreeably if we must." His voice was calm, but the conviction behind it was unmistakable. As the George Washington approached Europe, the sense of anticipation grew. The ship passed the Azores, then continued toward the coast of France. On the morning of December 13th, it entered the harbor of Brest. The reception was unlike anything Wilson had ever experienced. French battleships lined the water, their decks crowded with sailors standing at attention. Cannons fired salutes that echoed across the bay. Bands played the Star-Spangled Banner, their notes rising above the roar of the sea. On shore, thousands of people gathered, soldiers in uniform, officials in ceremonial dress, women in traditional Breton attire with white lace coifs. Wilson stood on the bridge of the ship, watching the spectacle unfold. He did not smile. He simply absorbed it, humbled by the emotion directed toward him. To the French, he was not just a president. He was a symbol of hope. The journey from Brest to Paris was equally extraordinary. Crowds lined the railway tracks, waving flags, cheering, and in some places kneeling as the train passed. Families gathered in fields and small villages, their faces lit by the pale winter sun. Some prayed for him. Others simply watched, believing they were witnessing a moment that would shape the future. One American journalist later wrote that the reception felt almost religious in its intensity. Wilson, for all his reserve, felt the weight of it. He had come to Europe to help build a peace that would endure. Now he understood just how much the world expected of him. By the time he reached Paris, the city was alive with anticipation. Streets were crowded. Windows were filled with faces. The world's eyes were turning toward the peace conference, and Wilson stood at its center, admired, scrutinized, and burdened with the hopes of millions. The journey across the Atlantic had ended. The far more difficult journey, shaping the peace, was about to begin. Paris in early 1919 carried a strange mixture of winter chill and restless anticipation. The war had ended, but the city still bore the marks of strain. Rationed goods, wounded soldiers, families waiting for news that would never come. Yet beneath the fatigue, a quiet electricity hummed through the boulevards. Delegates from across the world were arriving, and with them came the hope, fragile, flickering, that a new order might be built from the wreckage. On January 18, 1919, the Paris Peace Conference formally opened. The setting was the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs on the Quai d'Orsay, a grand stone building overlooking the Seine. Its halls were lined with marble, its ceilings adorned with gilded ornamentation, its rooms filled with the soft rustle of papers and the low murmur of translators. The conference chamber itself was arranged in a horseshoe shape, draped in green baize, the chairs upholstered in rich fabrics that contrasted sharply with the somber purpose of the gathering. Outside, the river moved slowly under the pale winter light. Inside, the world's future was about to be debated. The scale of the task was staggering. The war had redrawn borders, toppled empires, and left millions displaced. The delegates were responsible for determining the fate of more than 400 million Europeans, along with millions more in the Middle East and the former German colonies in Africa and the Pacific. The questions before them were immense. How should borders be redrawn? Which nations would rise? Which would fall? How could peace be secured in a world still trembling from violence? Yet the conference was not a single, unified body. It was a sprawling organism, messy, complex, and often unwieldy. 58 commissions were eventually formed, each tasked with examining a different issue: reparations, territorial claims, labor rights, the treatment of prisoners, the future of colonies, the rules of navigation, and countless others. Delegates moved between rooms like actors in a vast, intricate play, carrying maps, documents, and the weight of their nation's expectations. The sheer volume of work made Wilson's dream of open covenants, openly arrived at, feel almost impossible. Transparency was a noble ideal, but the machinery of peace was too large, too tangled, too dependent on private negotiation. Notably absent from the conference were two major powers. Russia, once a central player in European politics, was excluded. The Bolshevik Revolution had plunged the country into civil war, and the Western powers refused to recognize Lenin's government. The outcome of the conflict between the Red and White armies remained uncertain, and the Allies were unwilling to grant legitimacy to a regime they viewed with suspicion and fear. Germany, along with its wartime allies, Austria, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Turkey, was also barred from the negotiations. They would be summoned later to receive the terms, but they would not participate in shaping them. The victors would decide the peace. The defeated would accept it. This exclusion cast a long shadow over the proceedings. To manage the overwhelming complexity, the major Allied powers formed a smaller body known as the Council of Ten, composed of 2 representatives each from the United States, Britain, France, Italy, and Japan. But even this proved too large, too slow, too divided. Gradually, real authority condensed into an even smaller group, the leaders of the 4 most influential nations. George Clemenceau of France, David Lloyd George of Britain, Woodrow Wilson of the United States, Vittorio Orlando of Italy. They met behind closed doors, often without minutes, often without witnesses, shaping decisions that would reverberate across continents. Their personalities, ambitions, and disagreements would define the course of the conference. Paris swelled with people during these weeks: diplomats, journalists, military officers, economists, activists, and representatives of countless causes. Some came with petitions. Others came with maps. Still others came simply to be near the center of world affairs, hoping to influence the outcome in whatever small way they could. Hotels overflowed. Cafes buzzed with speculation. Newspapers printed rumors as quickly as they heard them. The city became a crossroads of ideas, anxieties, and aspirations. And through it all, the delegates walked the corridors of the Quai d'Orsay, carrying with them the hopes of nations and the burdens of history. The conference had begun. The world was watching, and the decisions made in those ornate rooms would shape the century to come. The early months of 1919 unfolded with a quiet intensity inside the grand rooms of the Paris Peace Conference. Outside, winter softened into a pale, hesitant spring, and the city carried the muted hum of a world trying to steady itself after years of upheaval. But within the conference halls, where diplomats moved through corridors lined with marble and gold, the atmosphere was dense with purpose. The war had ended, but the peace still needed to be shaped, not only in borders and reparations, but in the creation of something entirely new. At the center of this effort stood Woodrow Wilson, carrying with him a vision he believed could alter the course of history. He spoke of a League of Nations, a permanent body where disputes could be resolved through dialogue rather than violence, where nations could gather not as rivals but as partners, and where the tragedies of the past might be prevented from repeating themselves. To Wilson, the League was not an accessory to the treaty. It was the foundation upon which everything else must rest. And so, before the conference could settle the fate of territories or determine the scale of reparations, the delegates turned their attention to the Covenant, the document that would define the League's structure, its purpose, and its promise. The meetings began in rooms filled with quiet concentration. Papers were spread across polished tables. Maps lay rolled in corners, waiting for their turn. Translators murmured in soft tones as diplomats from different nations tried to find common language, not only in words but in ideals. The air carried the faint scent of ink and old wood, mingling with the low rustle of documents being passed from hand to hand. Wilson presided with a calm, deliberate presence. His voice, though gentle, carried conviction. He believed the League could become a safeguard for humanity, a place where grievances could be aired before they hardened into conflict, where nations could commit to mutual respect, and where the world might learn to settle its disputes without resorting to war. His idealism was steady, almost serene, even as the practical challenges of drafting the Covenant grew more apparent. For the task was not simple. It required reconciling competing interests, balancing national pride with collective responsibility, and crafting language that could withstand the pressures of future crises. One of the earliest challenges came from Wilson's own country. Many Americans feared that joining an international organization would compromise national sovereignty. They worried that the United States might be drawn into conflicts not of its choosing, bound by obligations that superseded the Constitution. To address these concerns, Wilson insisted that the Covenant include language affirming that the League would not interfere with existing regional arrangements, particularly the Monroe Doctrine, which had long guided American policy in the Western Hemisphere. The clause was added, though not without debate. Some delegates saw it as a necessary reassurance. Others viewed it as an exception that undermined the League's universality. But Wilson believed it was essential if the United States was to join the new organization, and he held firm. Another challenge emerged from across the Pacific. The Japanese delegation, representing a nation that had fought alongside the Allies, proposed that the covenant affirm the principle of racial equality. It was a bold request, one that reflected Japan's desire for recognition as a major power and for equal standing among the world's nations. The idea stirred discomfort among several Western delegations. Some feared domestic backlash. Others worried about the implications for their colonial systems. The debate grew tense, and though the proposal received support from many quarters, it ultimately failed to gain unanimous approval. Instead, Japan was offered a procedural concession. Decisions within the League would require unanimous consent, giving every member, including Japan, the power to veto actions they opposed. It was a compromise, but one that revealed the limits of the idealism that had inspired the League's creation. Wilson also found himself making concessions on other fronts, hoping that the League, once established, could address injustices that could not be resolved in the moment. Two of the most difficult issues involved Italy and Japan. Italy, represented by Premier Vittorio Orlando, demanded the territories promised in the secret Treaty of London. Wilson opposed secret agreements on principle, but he also feared that denying Italy would destabilize its fragile government. He compromised reluctantly, believing the League might later provide a forum for revisiting the issue. Japan, meanwhile, insisted on receiving control of Shantung, a region in China previously held by Germany. Wilson objected, believing the transfer violated the principle of self-determination. But Britain and France supported Japan's claim, and Wilson eventually yielded, another concession he hoped the League might one day correct. Each compromise weighed on him. Each one chipped away at the purity of his vision. But he believed the League itself was worth the sacrifice. As the drafting continued, the covenant began to take shape. It outlined procedures for arbitration. It established mechanisms for collective security. It created a framework for international cooperation that had never existed before. The language was careful, deliberate, and at times idealistic, a reflection of the hope that had carried the world through the darkest years of the war. When the first draft was completed, Wilson felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. It was not perfect. It was not everything he had imagined, but it was a beginning, a structure upon which a more peaceful world might be built. Outside the conference halls, Paris moved through its early spring rhythms. Carriages rolled over cobblestones. Newspapers speculated about the negotiations. Delegates hurried through the cold air, their breath rising in pale clouds. The city, still recovering from the war, seemed to hold its breath as the covenant took form. Inside, the work continued, steady, deliberate, hopeful. The Covenant of the League of Nations stood as the first major achievement of the peace conference, a document born from debate, compromise, and the fragile belief that humanity could learn from its own suffering. The work of peace was far from finished, but the foundation had been laid. And for a moment, the world allowed itself to imagine a future shaped not by conflict, but by cooperation. In the early months of 1919, as the Paris Peace Conference settled into its long, intricate rhythm, the delegates found themselves navigating not only the vast questions of borders and reparations, but also the quieter, more volatile disputes that threatened to unravel the fragile unity of the victors. These disputes did not roar like artillery or shake the ground like advancing armies. Instead, they simmered beneath the surface, slow, persistent, and deeply rooted in national pride. Two of them, in particular, cast long shadows over the negotiations: Italy's demands along the Adriatic coast and Japan's insistence on controlling the Shantung Peninsula in China. Both disputes revealed the limits of idealism. Both tested Woodrow Wilson's resolve. Both exposed the fault lines running beneath the Allied coalition. And both unfolded with a kind of quiet intensity that shaped the tone of the conference in ways few had anticipated. Italy arrived in Paris with expectations shaped not by the 14 points, but by the secret Treaty of London, an agreement forged in the darkest days of the war, when the Allies had promised Italy generous territorial rewards in exchange for joining their cause. The Adriatic coastline, with its deep harbors and strategic ports, had been at the center of those promises. To Italian leaders, especially Prime Minister Vittorio Orlando, these commitments were not negotiable. They were the price of Italy's sacrifice. But Wilson saw the matter differently. He believed the Adriatic question should be resolved through the principle of self-determination, not through secret wartime bargains. He believed the people living along the coast, Croats, Slovenes, and others, deserved a voice in their own future. And he believed that honoring the Treaty of London would undermine the moral foundation of the peace he hoped to build. The clash between these visions unfolded slowly, like a tide pulling against a rocky shore. Orlando argued passionately for Italy's claims, invoking history, sacrifice, and national honor. Wilson responded with calm conviction, insisting that the new world they were trying to create could not be built on the old world's hidden agreements. The tension grew with each passing week. Meetings that began with polite greetings soon drifted into strained exchanges. Maps were unrolled, studied, and rolled again. Delegates spoke in measured tones that barely concealed their frustration. Italy felt betrayed. Wilson felt cornered. The other allies watched uneasily, aware that the unity of the conference was at stake. Finally, in a moment of dramatic protest, Orlando left Paris altogether, hoping his absence would force the other leaders to reconsider Italy's demands. But the conference continued without him, and when he eventually returned, the damage had been done. Italy would leave the peace process feeling slighted, its sense of humiliation feeding political movements that would reshape its future. The Adriatic dispute had not erupted into violence, but it had left a scar. While Italy's frustrations simmered in the west, another conflict unfolded in the east, one that tested Wilson's ideals even more severely. Japan, a member of the victorious Allies, had seized the German-controlled region of Shantung during the war. Now, at the peace conference, Japan demanded formal recognition of its control. Wilson objected. He believed the transfer violated the principle of self-determination. He believed China's sovereignty should be respected. He believed the peace should not reward imperial expansion. But Japan was not alone in its claim. Britain and France supported Japan, and both nations reminded Wilson that Japan had been a loyal ally, contributing ships and soldiers to the war effort. The pressure mounted, quiet but relentless. Wilson fought the decision with a determination that surprised even those closest to him. He argued in private meetings. He appealed to the moral conscience of the other delegates. He warned that granting Japan control of Shantung would undermine the very principles the conference claimed to uphold. But in the end, he yielded. Japan received Shantung. It was one of the most painful compromises of Wilson's career, a moment when the world he hoped to build collided with the world that already existed. He consoled himself with the belief that the League of Nations, once established, might one day correct the injustice. But for China, the decision was a deep cut. And for Japan, It was a step toward greater ambition. The Shantung settlement did not break the conference, but it revealed how fragile the peace truly was. Together, the Adriatic and Shantung crises exposed the limits of the ideals that had guided the early days of the conference. They showed how difficult it was to balance principle with power, justice with politics, vision with reality. They revealed the tensions that lay beneath the surface of the Allied coalition, tensions that would shape the treaty, the League, and the world that emerged from the war. Wilson compromised because he believed the League of Nations was worth the sacrifice. He believed the structure of peace mattered more than any single territorial decision. He believed the future could be shaped through cooperation, even if the present required painful concessions. But each compromise left a mark. Italy felt betrayed. Japan felt emboldened. China felt abandoned. And the world, still fragile from the war, absorbed these tensions quietly, like cracks forming beneath the surface of a frozen lake. The conference moved on. The delegates returned to their maps, their committees, their long debates about borders and reparations. But the memory of these disputes lingered, shaping the tone of the negotiations and reminding everyone that peace, no matter how carefully crafted, was never simple. The Adriatic and Shantung crises had not derailed the conference, but they had revealed the fault lines that would one day widen into deeper fractures. And in their quiet, persistent way, they became part of the unfinished story of the peace that followed the Great War. The question of reparations drifted into the Paris Peace Conference like a slow-moving storm, gathering weight and complexity long before it finally broke across the negotiating tables. It was not a single issue but a constellation of grievances, expectations, and fears, each one shaped by the devastation of the war and the uncertain future that lay ahead. Delegates approached the topic with a mixture of caution and urgency, aware that the decisions they made would ripple across generations. The war had left Europe wounded in ways that were difficult to measure. Cities lay in ruins. Farmland had been churned into mud. Railways, factories, and ports had been shattered by years of bombardment. Millions of families mourned the loss of loved ones, and millions more faced the daunting task of rebuilding their lives from fragments. Reparations, in the minds of many, were not simply a matter of economics. They were a matter of justice, a way to acknowledge suffering and to ensure that the burden of recovery did not fall solely on the nations that had endured the greatest destruction. But justice, as the delegates soon discovered, was not easily defined. France entered the discussions with a sense of urgency sharpened by memory. The war had been fought on French soil. Entire regions had been reduced to rubble. Villages had vanished beneath artillery fire. Factories had been dismantled or destroyed. The French delegation, led by Georges Clemenceau, carried with them the weight of a nation that had suffered deeply and visibly. They believed Germany should pay for the damage it had caused, not out of vengeance, but out of necessity. Without reparations, France feared it would never fully recover. Britain's position was more complicated. The British Isles had been spared invasion, but the war had drained the nation's finances and strained its industries. Prime Minister David Lloyd George faced a public that demanded compensation, yet he also understood that a Germany crushed by excessive reparations might destabilize Europe rather than secure it. Britain needed a stable trading partner, not a broken one. And so Lloyd George walked a careful line, balancing domestic pressure with geopolitical foresight. The United States, guided by Woodrow Wilson's idealism, approached the issue with caution. Wilson believed reparations should be fair, not punitive. He feared that excessive demands would sow resentment and undermine the peace he hoped to build. Yet even he could not ignore the devastation Europe had endured. The challenge lay in finding a balance, a sum that acknowledged suffering without crippling Germany's future. The debates unfolded slowly, like a long, winding river cutting through difficult terrain. Economists presented figures that stretched into the unimaginable. Politicians argued over principles. Delegates pored over reports detailing the destruction of roads, bridges, factories, and homes. The numbers shifted constantly, rising and falling with each new calculation, each new argument, each new attempt to quantify the unquantifiable. Some believed Germany should pay for the full cost of the war, not only the physical damage, but the pensions owed to soldiers and their families. Others argued that such demands would be impossible to meet. Germany's economy, already strained by years of conflict and blockade, could not bear the weight of limitless reparations. The discussions grew tense. The room grew warm. The air thickened with the pressure of competing visions. But the delegates pressed on, aware that the world was watching. As the debates intensified, the question of responsibility emerged with renewed force. Who had caused the war? Who should bear the cost of its devastation? The answers were not simple, yet the desire for clarity, for a statement that could anchor the reparations debate, grew stronger with each passing day. Eventually, the delegates crafted a clause that would become one of the most controversial elements of the treaty. A statement assigning responsibility for the war and its consequences to Germany and its allies. It was not intended as a moral judgment, but as a legal foundation for reparations. Yet to Germany, the clause felt like a condemnation, a mark of shame that would linger long after the ink had dried. The war guilt clause became a symbol, heavy with meaning. For the Allies, it justified the reparations they demanded. For Germany, it deepened the sense of humiliation that had begun to take root. Even as the clause was drafted, the delegates remained unable to agree on a final reparations figure. The numbers were too large, the consequences too uncertain, the political pressures too intense. And so they created a reparations commission, a body that would determine the exact amount later, once the treaty had been signed and the world had begun to stabilize. This decision, meant as a compromise, left many uneasy. Germany feared the commission would impose an impossible burden. France feared the commission would be too lenient, and Britain feared the entire process might destabilize Europe. But the delegates had reached the limits of what they could decide in Paris. Outside the conference halls, Paris moved through its early spring rhythms. The Seine flowed steadily beneath its bridges. Cafes filled with quiet conversations. Newspapers speculated about the negotiations, their headlines shifting with each new rumor. The city, still recovering from the war, seemed to hold its breath as the reparations debate unfolded. Inside, the delegates continued their work, slow, deliberate, and heavy with consequence. The reparations question had not been resolved, but it had been framed, and in that framing, the future of Europe and the fragile peace that followed the Great War began to take shape. The struggle over reparations would continue long after the conference ended. It would shape economies, politics, and public sentiment. It would influence elections, fuel resentment, and deepen divisions. It would become one of the central threads in the story of the interwar years. But in the quiet rooms of Paris, in the early months of 1919, the delegates could not yet see the full arc of what they were creating. They could only sense the weight of their decisions, heavy, uncertain, and impossible to escape. And so Section 17 closes with the world poised on the edge of a new era, its future shaped by debates that were as emotional as they were economic, as human as they were political, and as fragile as the peace they sought to preserve. The question of the Rhineland drifted into the Paris Peace Conference with a quiet but unmistakable gravity, the kind that settles into a room long before anyone speaks. It was a region of rivers and vineyards, of ancient towns and winding roads, but it was also a place where history had carved deep scars. For France, the Rhineland was not merely a borderland. It was a shield, or it could be, if the peace were shaped correctly. And for Germany, it was a core part of its territory, a region tied to identity, industry, and pride. The delegates understood that whatever they decided here would echo far beyond the conference halls. The Rhineland was not simply a line on a map. It was a question of safety, of trust, of fear, and of the fragile balance between punishment and stability. And so the debate began, slow and deliberate, like a long breath drawn before a difficult conversation. France entered the discussion with memories that were still raw. Twice in living memory, German armies had crossed the Rhine and marched into French territory. Twice, the French countryside had been torn apart by invasion. Clemenceau carried these memories with him like a weight, and he spoke of them not with anger, but with the weary clarity of someone who had seen too much to pretend otherwise. He wanted the Rhineland separated from Germany, either as an independent state, a buffer zone, or a region placed under long-term Allied control. To him, this was not a matter of ambition. It was a matter of survival. Without a barrier, he believed, France would always live under the shadow of another attack. His voice, calm but unyielding, filled the room with the gravity of a man who had watched his nation bleed. Britain, however, viewed the matter differently. Lloyd George understood France's fears, but he also understood the dangers of dismantling Germany too severely. A fractured Germany might become unstable. An unstable Germany might become unpredictable. And an unpredictable Germany, he feared, might create more problems than it solved. He argued for moderation, for a solution that would protect France without crippling Germany. Britain wanted a Europe that could recover, trade, and rebuild. A Europe where Germany, though restrained, remained strong enough to contribute to stability rather than chaos. His position was careful, measured, and rooted in the belief that peace required balance, not domination. Wilson, standing between these two visions, felt the weight of both. He believed deeply in fairness, in the idea that peace must be built on principles rather than fear. He understood France's trauma, yet he also believed that carving away German territory would undermine the very ideals he had brought to Paris. He sought a compromise, something that would reassure France without violating the principle of territorial integrity, something that would restrain Germany without humiliating it, something that would allow the League of Nations to serve as the true guarantor of peace. But ideals, no matter how noble, were difficult to defend in rooms filled with men who had watched their nations suffer. The debate stretched on for weeks. Maps were unrolled across long tables, their edges curling like old parchment. Delegates traced rivers with their fingertips, studied railway lines, and argued over distances measured in miles but felt in memories. The discussions grew tense, though rarely loud. The tension was quieter than that, a tightening of shoulders, a pause before speaking, a glance exchanged across the table. France insisted on security. Britain insisted on stability. Wilson insisted on principle. And the Rhineland sat at the center of it all, silent and unmoving, as though waiting for the world to decide its fate. Eventually, a compromise emerged, not perfect, not entirely satisfying to anyone, but workable. The Rhineland would remain part of Germany, but it would be demilitarized. No German troops, no fortifications, no military presence of any kind. Allied forces would occupy the region for a period of years, ensuring that Germany could not use it as a launching point for another invasion. It was a solution built from caution and hope in equal measure. France gained a measure of protection. Germany retained its territory, and Britain avoided the creation of a new political fault line. In addition, Wilson preserved the principle of territorial integrity. The compromise did not erase the fears that had shaped the debate, but it softened them. Still, the decision carried consequences that were not immediately visible. For France, the demilitarization offered reassurance, but not certainty. For Germany, it felt like a restriction, a reminder of defeat, a symbol of vulnerability. For the Allies, it became a test of trust, one that would require vigilance long after the conference ended. The Rhineland, once a region of quiet towns and rolling hills, had become a symbol of the fragile peace the world was trying to build. Outside the conference halls, Paris moved through its early spring rhythms. The Seine flowed steadily beneath its bridges. Carriages rattled over cobblestones. Delegates walked through the cold morning air, their breath rising in pale clouds as they prepared for another day of negotiation. Inside, the work continued, slow, deliberate, and heavy with consequence. The Rhineland question had not broken the conference, but it had revealed the depth of the fears that shaped it. It had shown how difficult it was to build peace in a world still haunted by war. And so Section 18 closes with a compromise, fragile, imperfect, and deeply human. A compromise shaped by memory, by fear, by hope, and by the belief that peace, even when uncertain, is worth pursuing. The Rhineland would remain German, but it would remain unarmed. And in that delicate balance, the world placed its trust. The winter of 1919 settled over Paris with a quiet heaviness, a kind of muted stillness that seemed to seep into the very stones of the city. Snow fell in thin, drifting veils, softening the rooftops and muffling the sounds of carriage wheels along the boulevards. Inside the conference halls, however, the atmosphere was anything but calm. The peace that had been so desperately awaited was proving far more difficult to shape than anyone had imagined. The leaders of the great Allied powers, Wilson, Lloyd George, and Clemenceau, moved through these days with a mixture of determination and fatigue. Each carried the weight of his nation's expectations. Each believed he understood what the future required. And each, in his own way, felt the pressure of time closing in. The early optimism that had greeted Wilson's arrival was beginning to fray. The unity forged in war was dissolving in peace. And the negotiations, once filled with lofty ideals, were becoming increasingly strained. The meetings of the Big Three often began in polite tones, with formal greetings and measured words. But as the hours passed, the conversations grew sharper. Maps were spread across tables, borders debated, reparations argued over, and the fate of entire regions decided with strokes of a pen. The stakes were enormous, and the personalities involved were formidable. Clemenceau, the elder statesman of France, carried himself with the stern resolve of a man who had seen his country invaded twice in his lifetime. His eyes were sharp, his voice clipped, his patience thin. He wanted security, real, tangible, permanent security, for France. He wanted Germany weakened so thoroughly that it could never again threaten French soil. And he was prepared to fight for that vision with every ounce of his considerable will. Lloyd George, quick-witted and politically agile, moved between positions with the grace of a seasoned negotiator. He understood the desires of the British public, who demanded both justice and stability. He knew that Britain's empire depended on maintaining a balance of power in Europe, and he recognized that the peace must be firm, but not so harsh that it sowed the seeds of future conflict. Wilson, meanwhile, held fast to his ideals. He believed in principles. He believed in fairness. He believed that the world could be guided by reason rather than revenge. But ideals, no matter how noble, were difficult to defend in rooms filled with men who had watched their nations bleed. As the weeks passed, the tension among the three leaders grew more pronounced. Their disagreements were not merely political, they were personal. Each man had his own temperament, his own rhythm, his own way of approaching conflict. And those differences, once manageable, began to collide. Clemenceau's bluntness grated on Wilson's sense of decorum. Wilson's moralizing irritated Clemenceau's pragmatism. Lloyd George, caught between them, shifted positions like a man trying to keep balance on a moving deck. There were moments when the discussions grew so heated that the room seemed to vibrate with unspoken frustration. Voices rose. Hands slammed against tables. Papers were pushed aside. The air thickened with the weight of clashing visions. And yet, beneath the arguments, there was a shared understanding. The decisions they made would shape the world for generations. One morning, as the leaders gathered for another round of negotiations, the meeting was interrupted by a sudden commotion. A messenger entered the room, pale and breathless, carrying news that struck the conference like a bolt of lightning. Clemenceau had been shot. The attack had occurred on a Paris street, carried out by a young anarchist who opposed the peace negotiations. The bullet struck the French premier in the chest, dangerously close to his heart. For a moment, the future of the conference, and perhaps the future of Europe, hung in the balance. But Clemenceau survived. He returned to work astonishingly quickly, his body weakened but his resolve unbroken. The incident only hardened his determination. He became even more unyielding in his demands, even more insistent that Germany must be restrained, even more convinced that France's security depended on a peace built not on trust, but on vigilance. The shooting cast a long shadow over the conference. It reminded the delegates that the world outside their chambers was volatile, restless, and deeply divided. It underscored the urgency of their task, and it deepened the rifts among the big three. Wilson, already exhausted by the relentless pace of negotiations, felt the strain acutely. His health, never robust, began to falter. He suffered from headaches, insomnia, and bouts of fatigue that left him pale and withdrawn. Yet he pushed himself forward, driven by the belief that the League of Nations must be secured at any cost. Lloyd George, sensing the shifting dynamics, maneuvered carefully. He sought compromise where he could, but he also recognized that the political winds at home demanded a firm stance. He could not return to Britain with a treaty that appeared weak or lenient. Clemenceau, recovering from the attempt on his life, became more forceful than ever. He pressed for harsh terms, for guarantees, for measures that would ensure France's safety even if it meant Germany's humiliation. The three men circled one another like planets locked in a gravitational struggle, each influencing the others, each pulled by forces both personal and political. There were moments of calm amid the storm. Moments when the leaders paused, took a breath, and remembered the enormity of what they were trying to accomplish. Moments when the conversation softened, when the maps were set aside, when the weight of the past 4 years settled over them like a quiet snowfall. But those moments were fleeting. The disagreements returned. The arguments resumed. The pressure mounted. And through it all, the world waited. The tension among the big three was not merely a matter of personality. It was a reflection of the deeper fractures running through the peace conference itself. The war had ended, but the wounds it left behind were raw. Nations demanded justice. Others demanded revenge. Still others demanded recognition, independence, or restitution. The leaders were trying to build a new world on the ruins of the old one. And the ruins were still smoldering. As winter gave way to early spring, the negotiations grew more intense. The leaders met daily, sometimes for hours at a time, sometimes late into the night. Their discussions ranged from the fate of the Rhineland to the structure of the League, from reparations to disarmament, from colonial mandates to the future of Eastern Europe. Every decision felt monumental. Every disagreement felt like a fault line. And the strain among the big three, once subtle, had become impossible to ignore. Yet despite the tension, despite the arguments, despite the moments when the entire process seemed on the verge of collapse, the work continued. The leaders pressed forward, driven by the knowledge that the world could not afford failure. They were tired, frustrated, and often at odds. But they were also bound by a shared responsibility, one that transcended their differences. The peace had to be made, and they were the ones who had to make it. In the end, the rising tensions among the big three were not a sign of weakness. They were a sign of the enormity of the task before them. The world they were trying to shape was vast, complex, and deeply wounded. No simple agreement could heal it. No single vision could define it. The arguments, the disagreements, the moments of near collapse, they were all part of the process of forging a peace that, however imperfect, would carry the world into the next chapter of its history. And as the leaders left the conference rooms each night, stepping into the cold Paris air, they carried with them the knowledge that the decisions they made in those tense, crowded rooms would echo far beyond their own lifetimes. The winter light over Paris had begun to shift, softening into the pale tones of early spring. The Seine moved slowly beneath its bridges, carrying with it the faint reflections of a city caught between exhaustion and expectation. Inside the conference halls, however, the atmosphere remained taut. The question that hovered over every conversation, every map, every whispered exchange was simple in phrasing but immense in consequence. What should become of Germany? The war had ended, but the memory of its devastation was still raw. Entire regions lay in ruins. Families mourned losses too deep to measure. Nations struggled to rebuild their economies, their cities, their sense of stability. And at the center of it all stood Germany, defeated, disarmed, and yet still powerful enough to shape the future if not carefully restrained. The leaders of the Allied powers understood this. They felt it in their bones. And so the discussions about Germany became the heart of the peace negotiations. The meetings began with maps, large, detailed, meticulously drawn. They covered tables like vast tapestries, each line representing a border, each color a claim, each symbol a reminder of the war's shifting front lines. Delegates leaned over them, tracing the contours of rivers and mountains, debating the fate of towns and provinces. Clemenceau approached these maps with a fierce clarity. For him, the question was not abstract. It was personal. France had suffered deeply, its fields turned to mud, its villages destroyed, its people scarred by years of occupation and bombardment. Clemenceau believed that Germany must be weakened so thoroughly that it could never again threaten French soil. He wanted the Rhineland separated, demilitarized, or placed under Allied control. He wanted Germany's military power dismantled piece by piece. He wanted security, not promises. Lloyd George, though sympathetic to France's suffering, saw the issue differently. Britain had fought bravely and lost many lives, but its homeland had not been invaded. Its cities still stood. Its industries still functioned. Lloyd George understood that a completely broken Germany might destabilize Europe rather than secure it. A starving, resentful nation could become fertile ground for extremism. A shattered economy could drag down the entire continent. He sought balance, punishment yes, but not annihilation. Wilson, meanwhile, viewed the question through the lens of principle. He believed in justice, not vengeance. He believed that peace must be fair, or it would not endure. But fairness was difficult to define in a room filled with grief. The discussions grew more intense as the days passed. The leaders debated the future of the Rhineland, a region that had long been a point of contention. Clemenceau wanted it separated from Germany entirely, transformed into a buffer state or placed under French control. Lloyd George resisted, fearing that such a move would sow resentment and instability. Wilson, caught between them, sought a compromise that would satisfy France's need for security without dismantling Germany's territorial integrity. Eventually, they agreed on a plan. The Rhineland would remain part of Germany, but it would be demilitarized. Allied troops would occupy the region for a period of years. Germany would be forbidden from placing soldiers or fortifications there. It was not the complete separation Clemenceau wanted, but it was a measure of protection, one that would shape the strategic landscape of Europe for decades. Next came the question of Germany's military. The Allied leaders agreed that Germany must never again possess the capacity to launch a war on the scale of 1914. And so they drafted terms that would reduce the German army to a fraction of its former size. Conscription would be abolished. The navy would be limited to a handful of small ships. Submarines were forbidden entirely. The Air Force, once a symbol of modern warfare, would be dismantled. These restrictions were sweeping, unprecedented, and deeply humiliating for a nation that had prided itself on military strength. But the Allies believed they were necessary. The memory of the war's opening months, of the rapid German advance, of the destruction left in its wake, was still too vivid to ignore. Then came the colonies. Germany's overseas territories, scattered across Africa and the Pacific, were placed under the control of the League of Nations as mandates. In practice, this meant that Britain, France, Japan, and other Allied powers would administer them. Germany would lose its empire entirely. To some, this was a matter of justice. To others, it was a redistribution of power disguised as principle. But the decision was made, and Germany's colonial ambitions came to an abrupt end. The most emotionally charged debates, however, centered on territory within Europe. Alsace and Lorraine, regions taken from France in 1871, would be returned. Parts of Prussia would be ceded to the newly reborn Poland. The city of Danzig would become a free city under international supervision. Other borders shifted as well, each change reflecting a complex blend of history, ethnicity, and political necessity. For Germany, these losses were painful. For its neighbors, they were seen as essential corrections. The maps changed slowly, line by line, as the leaders worked late into the night. Each adjustment carried consequences. Each decision shaped the future. Through it all, the tension among the Big Three continued to simmer. Kayali Munsah pushed for harsher terms. Lloyd George sought moderation. Wilson tried to hold the center, guided by ideals that were increasingly difficult to defend. Yet, despite their disagreements, the leaders understood that they were crafting more than a treaty. They were shaping the structure of Europe itself. They were determining how nations would interact, how borders would be drawn, how grievances would be addressed or ignored. They were building the framework of a new world. As the negotiations stretched on, the weight of the decisions began to show on the faces of the delegates. They moved through the halls with slower steps, their voices quieter, their expressions more solemn. The enormity of the task pressed down on them like a physical force. Outside, Paris continued its daily rhythm, carriages rolling over cobblestones, cafes filled with murmured conversations, the river flowing steadily beneath the bridges. But inside the conference rooms, time felt different. It felt heavier, denser, as though every hour carried the weight of decades. The fate of Germany was not just a political question. It was a question of memory, of fear, of justice, of hope. It was a question that touched every corner of Europe. And the answers the leaders crafted, imperfect, contentious, shaped by compromise, would echo far beyond the walls of the Quai d'Orsay. By the time the discussions drew to a close, the outlines of Germany's future had been set. Its borders were redrawn. Its military was dismantled. Its colonies were gone. Its pride was wounded. The leaders believed they had created a peace that would protect Europe. They hoped they had built a structure strong enough to prevent another catastrophe. But beneath the surface, tensions remained. Resentment simmered. Uncertainty lingered. And the world, though eager for stability, was entering a fragile new era. One shaped by decisions made in rooms filled with maps, arguments, and the quiet hum of history turning its pages. The question of reparations drifted through the conference halls like a persistent echo, never fully resolved, never fully understood, yet impossible to ignore. It hovered over every meeting, every private conversation, every late-night negotiation. The war had left Europe shattered, and someone, the leaders believed, would have to pay for the rebuilding. But deciding who should bear that burden, and how heavily, proved to be one of the most emotionally charged debates of the entire peace process. The delegates approached the issue with a mixture of grief, anger, and uncertainty. They carried memories of ruined towns, broken families, and economies pushed to the brink. They carried the expectations of their people, who demanded justice after years of suffering. And they carried the weight of history, which whispered warnings about the dangers of humiliation. Germany, defeated and exhausted, stood at the center of this storm. The discussions began with numbers, vast, almost unimaginable sums. Economists produced charts and tables, their inked lines attempting to quantify the cost of destruction. Bridges destroyed, factories dismantled, homes reduced to rubble, farmland poisoned by shells and gas. The losses were staggering, and no calculation could fully capture the human cost. France, having suffered the most direct devastation, pressed for reparations that would rebuild its shattered regions. Clemenceau argued with the intensity of a man who had walked through the ruins himself. He spoke of villages erased from the map, of families displaced, of fields that would take decades to recover. To him, reparations were not merely financial, they were moral. Britain, too, sought compensation, though its homeland had been spared invasion. Lloyd George faced a public that demanded Germany be held accountable. Newspapers had fueled expectations. Politicians had promised justice. The British people wanted to see Germany pay for the war they believed it had unleashed. Wilson, however, approached the issue with caution. He feared that excessive reparations would cripple Germany's economy. He feared that economic collapse would breed resentment. He feared that resentment would lead to future conflict. He believed in accountability, but not in vengeance. As the debates intensified, the leaders found themselves trapped between competing pressures. The public demanded harsh penalties. Economists warned of the dangers of destabilizing Germany. Politicians feared losing support if they appeared too lenient. And beneath it all lay a deeper question, one that no one could fully articulate. How do you rebuild a world without planting the seeds of another war? The tension grew sharper when the conversation turned to the issue of war guilt. Some delegates argued that Germany must accept responsibility for the conflict. Others believed that the causes of the war were too complex to assign blame to a single nation. But the pressure for a clear statement, something definitive, something symbolic, continued to mount. Eventually, the leaders agreed on a clause that would become one of the most controversial elements of the treaty. Article 231. It stated that Germany accepted responsibility for causing the war and the losses that resulted from it. It was not intended as a moral indictment, but as a legal foundation for reparations. Yet to the German people, it felt like a brand, a mark of shame imposed by the victors. The clause ignited outrage across Germany. Politicians denounced it. Newspapers condemned it. Citizens felt humiliated, betrayed, and cornered. The resentment it sparked would linger for years, simmering beneath the surface of German society. Meanwhile, the reparations themselves remained unresolved. The leaders could not agree on a final sum. The numbers were too large, the consequences too uncertain. And so they created a reparations commission, a body that would determine the exact amount later. Germany would be required to pay, but the details would come after the treaty was signed. This decision, meant as a compromise, only deepened the sense of uncertainty. Germany feared an unpayable burden. The Allies feared that too little would be offered. Economists feared that the entire structure of European finance might collapse under the strain. The issue hung in the air like a storm cloud, dark, heavy, and unresolved. Amid these debates, a few voices warned of the dangers ahead. Herbert Hoover, overseeing relief efforts, cautioned that starving a nation would not bring peace. Jan Smuts, the South African statesman, argued that the treaty was too harsh and would sow bitterness. And John Maynard Keynes, the brilliant British economist, resigned in protest, later writing a scathing critique that would shape public opinion for decades. Their warnings were quiet compared to the demands for justice. But they were not forgotten. As the leaders moved on to other issues, the question of reparations remained like a weight pressing on the treaty's foundations. It was a reminder that peace was not simply the absence of war. It was a delicate balance of justice, stability, and foresight. The decisions made in those rooms, about responsibility, about compensation, about guilt, would shape the economic and political landscape of Europe for years to come. And though the leaders hoped they had crafted a fair settlement, the future would reveal how fragile their creation truly was. Spring had only just begun to settle across France when the German delegation crossed the border and started the long journey toward Paris, moving through a landscape that seemed caught between seasons. as if the earth itself was unsure whether it was ready to welcome renewal after so much devastation. A faint warmth drifted through the air, not yet confident enough to claim the countryside, and the first hints of green appeared on the branches of trees that stretched upward with a kind of hesitant hope. Villages emerged and receded in gentle rhythm, clusters of stone houses, narrow lanes winding between gardens still waking from winter, and church spires rising above fields where the scars of war remained visible in the churned soil and broken fences. Inside the train that carried them, the German representatives sat in a silence that felt almost tangible, a quiet so dense it seemed to press against the windows and settle into the fabric of their coats. They were not traveling as diplomats arriving to shape the future, nor as equals preparing to negotiate the terms of peace. They were the emissaries of a defeated nation, summoned to receive conditions they had not helped craft, conditions they feared would be severe enough to reshape their country for generations. The mood inside the compartments shifted in slow, uneasy waves as the hours passed. Some delegates stared through the glass, watching the muted colors of the French countryside drift by, like scenes from a world that no longer felt familiar. Others leafed through documents without absorbing a word, their thoughts circling the same unspoken dread. A few exchanged quiet remarks, their voices barely rising above the hum of the train, each sentence trailing off as though the weight of the moment made speech itself difficult. They believed they understood what awaited them, though the truth was that fear filled the spaces where certainty should have been, and the closer they drew to Paris, the heavier that fear became. When the train finally reached the outskirts of the capital, the delegation was not taken into the city itself. Instead, they were escorted to the quieter town of Versailles, a place whose name carried centuries of ceremony and political theater, and which now carried the burden of a world attempting to rebuild itself after unimaginable loss. Their lodging was the Hôtel des Reservoirs, a stately building with tall windows and a dignified facade that had once welcomed aristocrats and visiting dignitaries. In another era, it might have felt like a retreat, but now it resembled a gilded enclosure, a place where comfort existed in form but not in spirit. Guards stood watch outside, and although the delegates were permitted to walk the grounds, they were not allowed to wander freely, a reminder that they were guests only in the most technical sense. Inside, the rooms were well appointed but carried a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. Heavy curtains softened the daylight into a muted glow, and the polished furniture, elegant and meticulously arranged, seemed indifferent to the anxiety of the men who sat upon it. The faint scent of wax and wood lingered in the air, a quiet reminder of a world that had existed long before the war and would continue long after, untouched by the turmoil of nations. The Germans waited, and the waiting itself became a slow, grinding form of torment, stretching the hours into something heavy and airless. The choice of Versailles had been intentional, a gesture steeped in symbolism and theatrical precision. Nearly 50 years earlier, in 1871, Germany had proclaimed its empire in the Hall of Mirrors after defeating France in the Franco-Prussian War. Now the roles were reversed, and the victors would dictate terms in the same palace where Germany had once celebrated its triumph. No one present, Allied or German, missed the significance of that reversal, and the palace seemed to hold the memory of those earlier celebrations in its gilded surfaces, as though the walls themselves understood the weight of the moment. When the day arrived for the Germans to receive the draft treaty, the palace felt unusually still, as if the air inside the Hall of Mirrors had thickened in anticipation. The chandeliers glittered above the long marble floor, and sunlight streamed through the tall windows, scattering across the polished surfaces and catching on the edges of the documents arranged on the table. The German delegation entered quietly, their footsteps echoing through the vast chamber as they passed mirrors that multiplied their strained expressions, gilded statues that watched in silent judgment, and rows of diplomats standing in rigid formation. The hall, once a stage for royal celebrations, now felt like a solemn tribunal. At the far end of the room, the Allied representatives waited. George Clemenceau stood at the center, his posture rigid and his gaze unwavering. David Lloyd George remained composed and alert, his expression carefully measured. Woodrow Wilson, tall and solemn, observed the proceedings with a mixture of resolve and sorrow. There were no greetings, no gestures of welcome, no attempt to soften the gravity of the moment. Clemenceau spoke with a firm, unadorned clarity, informing the Germans that the treaty was ready, that they would have time to examine it, and that they could submit written comments, while making it equally clear that the terms were not open to negotiation. The Germans listened in silence, their faces pale, their eyes revealing the shock they struggled to conceal. When the documents, hundreds of pages bound in heavy covers, were placed in their hands, the weight of the future settled upon them with a force that felt almost physical. Back at the Hotel des Reservoirs, the delegates began to read. They gathered in small groups, spreading the pages across tables, marking passages, and whispering to one another in disbelief. The terms were harsher than they had feared. Territorial losses that cut deeply into the nation's borders, military restrictions that stripped Germany of its ability to defend itself, reparations of staggering scale, the war guilt clause assigning responsibility for the conflict, the loss of colonies, the occupation of the Rhineland, and the demilitarization of vast regions. Each section struck like a blow, and each paragraph deepened their despair. Some argued that the treaty was impossible to accept, while others insisted that refusal would lead to renewed war, something Germany could not endure. A few simply stared at the pages, as though hoping the words might rearrange themselves into something less devastating. Outside, the gardens of Versailles remained serene, with birdsong drifting through the trees and fountains murmuring softly, the world beyond the hotel walls seemingly indifferent to the anguish unfolding within. As the days passed, the Germans drafted a long list of objections, detailed, reasoned, and increasingly desperate. They argued that the treaty violated Wilson's 14 points, that the reparations exceeded their capacity, that the territorial losses would cripple their economy, and that the war guilt clause was unjust. They submitted their response and waited once more, though the waiting felt heavier this time, as if the walls themselves were closing in. When the reply arrived, it was brief and final. The Allies rejected nearly all of Germany's objections. The terms would stand. The treaty must be signed. A deadline was set. The mood inside the Hotel des Reservoirs darkened further. Some delegates wept openly, while others paced the corridors in agitation, their footsteps echoing through the halls like restless ghosts. A few collapsed under the strain, overwhelmed by the enormity of what lay before them. One member of the delegation, unable to bear the despair any longer, took his own life, casting a deep shadow over the already somber atmosphere and reminding everyone present of the emotional toll the treaty had inflicted. The remaining delegates faced an impossible choice: sign the treaty and accept humiliation, or refuse and risk invasion. In the end, the German government, fractured, exhausted, and fearful, chose to sign. On June 28, 1919, exactly 5 years after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the German delegation returned to the Hall of Mirrors. The symbolism was deliberate, almost theatrical, as though history itself had arranged the moment with a sense of grim symmetry. The war had begun with a single act of violence, and now the peace would be sealed in the same room where Germany had once proclaimed its empire. The Germans signed with trembling hands, and the Allies signed with solemn expressions. The ceremony was brief, formal, and devoid of celebration. Outside, crowds gathered, some cheering, some weeping, some simply watching with uncertainty as the future unfolded before them. Inside the palace, the echoes of the signing faded into the vastness of the hall, marking the official end of the war and the beginning of a peace that was fragile, imperfect, and heavy with consequence. The Treaty of Versailles reached American shores in the summer of 1919, arriving not as a simple diplomatic document but as a sprawling symbol of the world's fragile hopes. It crossed the Atlantic wrapped in expectation, controversy, and the lingering exhaustion of a nation still adjusting to the silence that follows war. The guns had stopped, but the echoes remained, drifting through factories, farms, and city streets like a memory that refused to fade. And into that unsettled quiet came a treaty that promised peace while stirring a storm of debate. President Woodrow Wilson returned from Paris believing he carried the blueprint for a safer world. He believed the treaty, for all its imperfections, represented the best possible balance between justice and stability, and he believed the League of Nations was the essential mechanism that would prevent future catastrophes. His confidence was sincere, even noble, but the America he stepped back into was no longer the America he had left behind. The country had changed in his absence, and the political landscape had hardened in ways he had not fully anticipated. Newspapers had been publishing leaked details of the treaty for weeks, and the public had already begun forming opinions before Wilson even set foot on American soil. Some editorials praised the treaty as a triumph of diplomacy, a testament to American leadership on the world stage. Others condemned it as a betrayal of Wilson's own 14 points, arguing that the compromises made in Paris had diluted the moral clarity he had promised. Still others insisted the treaty was too harsh, too lenient, too idealistic, too entangling, a contradictory chorus that reflected the country's deep uncertainty about its role in the post-war world. Americans were tired. They were proud of their soldiers, proud of their industrial might, proud of the nation's emergence as a global power, yet they were also wary of foreign commitments and eager to turn inward. The war had disrupted daily life in ways that were still being felt. Factories were struggling to shift back to peacetime production. Workers were striking for better wages. Farmers were facing falling prices after years of wartime demand. Returning soldiers were searching for jobs in cities already strained by rapid change. And everywhere, people were trying to understand what America's future should look like now that the world had been remade. Into this atmosphere of uncertainty stepped the United States Senate, newly controlled by Republicans after the 1918 midterm elections. The Constitution required a two-thirds vote to ratify any treaty, and the Senate's most powerful figure, Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, was determined to assert the chamber's authority. Lodge was a scholar, a historian, and a man of formidable intellect, but he was also a political rival of Wilson's, and their relationship had deteriorated into something brittle and adversarial long before the treaty arrived. Lodge respected Wilson's mind but distrusted his methods. He resented being excluded from the peace delegation, and he believed the treaty, particularly the League of Nations, threatened American sovereignty. To Lodge, Article 10, the League's pledge to defend the territorial integrity of member states, was a dangerous entanglement that could drag the United States into foreign wars without congressional approval. He argued that it undermined the Constitution, weakened national independence, and entangled America in the political struggles of Europe. Wilson rejected these arguments outright. He believed Article 10 was the moral heart of the League, the mechanism that would prevent future wars by binding nations together in a shared commitment to peace. He believed the Senate was misreading the treaty, or worse, sabotaging it for political gain. And he believed the American people, if given the chance to hear his vision directly, would support him. The Senate hearings began in August 1919 and stretched on for weeks. Witnesses testified. Experts debated. Senators dissected every clause, every implication, every potential consequence. The hearings became a kind of national theater, with newspapers reporting on them daily and citizens following the debate with a mixture of fascination and fatigue. The country was divided. So was the Senate. And Wilson, watching from the White House, felt the ground shifting beneath him. Sensing the danger, he made a bold decision. He would take his case directly to the American people. In September 1919, he embarked on a cross-country speaking tour, a grueling journey that carried him through the Midwest, the Great Plains, the Rocky Mountains, and the Pacific Coast. He traveled by train, stopping in city after city, delivering speeches that blended idealism with urgency. Crowds gathered by the thousands. Some came out of admiration. Others came out of curiosity. A few came simply to witness history. Wilson spoke with passion, his voice rising and falling like a preacher's, weaving together the war's sacrifices, the promise of the League, and the moral responsibility he believed America carried. But the strain of the journey was immense. Wilson's health, already fragile, began to deteriorate. He suffered from headaches, exhaustion, and a persistent cough. His face grew pale. His movements slowed. His doctors grew alarmed. On September 25th, in Pueblo, Colorado, he delivered what would become his final public speech, a powerful, emotional plea for the League that left the audience in tears. Hours later, he collapsed. The tour ended abruptly. The president returned to Washington. Days later, he suffered a massive stroke. The nation did not know the full extent of his condition. The White House kept the details quiet. Wilson was incapacitated, and the treaty's fate now rested in the hands of a Senate that was deeply divided. In Wilson's absence, Lodge pressed forward with a series of reservations, amendments designed to limit America's obligations under the League. Some senators supported the treaty with reservations. Others opposed it entirely. A smaller group, loyal to Wilson's vision, refused to accept any changes. The Senate fractured into three camps, and compromise became impossible. The treaty became a battleground of pride, politics, and principle. On November 19, 1919, the Senate voted. The treaty failed. A second vote in March 1920 also failed. The United States would not join the League of Nations. It would not ratify the Treaty of Versailles. It would make a separate peace with Germany years later. The rejection stunned the world. Allies felt betrayed. Wilson felt devastated. Lodge felt vindicated. The League of Nations moved forward without the country that had inspired its creation. Its structure remained, but its strength was diminished. Its moral authority weakened. And the United States, having played a decisive role in ending the war, stepped back from the global stage just as the world was trying to rebuild. The treaty's reception in America revealed something deeper, a truth that would shape the century to come. The nation was powerful, but uncertain of how to use that power. It was idealistic, yet wary of entanglement. It was confident, yet divided. The debate over the treaty was not merely a political struggle. It was a reflection of America's identity at a moment of profound transition, a mirror held up to a country wrestling with its place in the world. And the consequences of that debate, its passions, its failures, its unresolved tensions, would echo far beyond the Senate chamber, shaping the world that emerged from the ashes of the Great War. The signing of the Treaty of Versailles sent ripples across the world, subtle at first, then widening into currents that touched nearly every continent. The war had ended, but the peace that followed was not a single moment. It was a long, uneven unfolding, a slow settling of dust over a landscape that had been shaken to its foundations. Nations watched the treaty with a mixture of relief, apprehension, and quiet wonder, as though trying to understand what kind of future had just been written for them. In Europe, the air carried a strange stillness. Cities were rebuilding. Families were grieving. Governments were trying to regain their footing after years of upheaval. The treaty promised stability, yet it also carried the weight of unresolved tensions. Borders had shifted. Empires had collapsed. New nations had emerged from the ruins of old ones, fragile and hopeful, but uncertain of how long their newfound independence would last. The world was breathing again, but the breaths were shallow. Across the former battlefields, the scars of war remained visible in the earth itself. Trenches stretched like faded wounds across the countryside. Shell craters filled with rainwater reflected the sky in still, broken circles. Villages that had once been bustling with life now stood silent. Their stone walls cracked, their roofs collapsed, their streets overgrown with weeds. The treaty could redraw borders, but it could not erase the physical memory of destruction. In France and Belgium, teams of workers moved slowly through the fields, clearing unexploded shells, marking graves, and trying to restore land that had been churned into mud by years of artillery fire. The work was painstaking. It would take decades. And even then, the soil would never be quite the same. The treaty promised peace, but the land whispered reminders of what peace had cost. Farther east, the map of Europe had been reshaped with bold strokes. New nations appeared where empires had once stood: Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and others, each carrying the hopes of people who had long dreamed of self-rule. Their flags, borders, and governments were new. And yet, beneath the surface, old rivalries lingered, waiting for moments of weakness or opportunity. The treaty had given these nations a chance, but it had also given them challenges that would test their strength. Ethnic groups found themselves divided by new lines. Minorities found themselves living under unfamiliar governments. And the promise of self-determination, so central to Wilson's vision, proved far more complicated in practice than it had seemed in theory. The new order was hopeful, but fragile. In the Middle East, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire created a different kind of uncertainty. Territories that had once been governed from Constantinople were now placed under mandates, arrangements that gave Britain and France administrative control while promising eventual independence. The language of the mandates was idealistic, but the reality was more complex. Local populations watched foreign administrators arrive with maps, documents, and assumptions that did not always align with the region's history or its intricate social fabric. The treaty had redrawn borders here too, but the lines were drawn by distant hands, and the consequences would unfold slowly, like a long shadow stretching across the desert. In Asia and Africa, the treaty's impact was felt in quieter, but no less significant ways. Germany's colonies were transferred to Allied powers under the mandate system, a change that altered the balance of influence across continents. For many people living under colonial rule, the treaty did not bring independence. It brought new administrators, new flags, and new promises that often sounded familiar. Yet the war had awakened something, a sense of possibility, a sense that the world was changing, and that empires were not as permanent as they once seemed. Movements for self-determination, still small and scattered, began to grow in confidence. The treaty did not grant them freedom, but it helped plant the idea that freedom was not impossible. The seeds were quiet, but they were there. Meanwhile, in Germany, the treaty's arrival was met with shock, anger, and profound humiliation. The terms were harsher than many had expected. The loss of territory, the military restrictions, the reparations, the war guilt clause, each element struck a different nerve, and together they created a sense of national woundedness that would linger for years. Crowds gathered in public squares to denounce the treaty. Newspapers printed scathing editorials. Politicians argued bitterly about whether the nation should accept or reject the terms. The government, weakened and divided, ultimately chose to sign. But the resentment did not fade. It settled into the national consciousness like a cold fog. The treaty had ended the war, but it had not ended the anger. In Britain and France, the reaction was more complicated. Many people welcomed the treaty as a necessary step toward rebuilding. They believed Germany had to be held accountable. They believed the sacrifices of the war demanded justice. Yet even among the victors, there were voices of concern, economists, diplomats, and ordinary citizens who wondered whether the treaty was too harsh, too ambitious, or too fragile to endure. Some feared that Germany's resentment would fester. Some feared that the new borders would create new conflicts. Some feared that the League of Nations, noble in concept, lacked the power to enforce its ideals. The treaty was celebrated, but it was also questioned. Across the Atlantic, the United States watched the global reaction with a mixture of pride and distance. Wilson had returned home believing the treaty would be ratified, but the Senate's rejection left America standing apart from the new international order. The League of Nations moved forward without the country that had inspired its creation, and the world took note. Some nations felt abandoned. Others felt relieved. Still others wondered what America's withdrawal meant for the future. The treaty had reshaped the world, but the absence of the United States from the League left a gap, a missing pillar in a structure that was already delicate. As months passed, the treaty settled into place like a vast, intricate mechanism, one with many moving parts, each dependent on the others. It was ambitious. It was flawed. It was hopeful. It was fragile. And it was the best the world could manage in the aftermath of a conflict that had shattered the old order beyond repair. The treaty did not create a perfect peace. It created a peace that needed tending, patience, and wisdom. A peace that required cooperation, demanded and humility. A peace that would be tested again and again. The world exhaled, slowly, cautiously, as though unsure whether the quiet would last. And in that quiet, the future began to take shape, not with certainty, but with possibility. In the years that followed the Treaty of Versailles, the world drifted into a strange and delicate quiet. A quiet that felt less like the calm after a storm and more like the stillness before something yet unnamed. The war had ended. The treaty had been signed. Nations had returned to their borders, their parliaments, their daily routines. And yet, beneath the surface of this new order, there was a sense that the peace was incomplete, as though the ink on the treaty had dried before the wounds of the world had even begun to close. People spoke of peace as though it were a destination, a final point on a long and painful journey. But peace, as the years revealed, was not a single moment. It was a process, fragile, uneven, and deeply human. It required patience. It required humility. It required a willingness to see beyond the immediate relief of war's end and into the deeper currents that shaped the future. The treaty had created a framework. But a framework is only the beginning. Across Europe, the physical scars of the war remained visible in the landscape. Fields once churned by artillery slowly returned to green, though the soil held memories of iron and fire. Forests regrew in places where trees had been splintered by shells. Villages rebuilt their homes stone by stone, their church bells ringing again after years of silence. Yet even as life returned, the land carried a quiet heaviness, as though it remembered everything that had happened and was reluctant to forget. Families tried to rebuild their lives with a mixture of hope and hesitation. Some found comfort in routine, in the rhythm of work, in the laughter of children, and with the simple act of gathering around a table at the end of the day. Others struggled to move forward, weighed down by grief that lingered like a shadow at the edge of every conversation. The war had taken so much, and the treaty, for all its ambition, could not restore what had been lost. The peace was real, but it was not whole. In Germany, the treaty's impact was felt in every corner of society. The economic strain, the political instability, the sense of national humiliation, all of it combined to create a mood that was difficult to describe and impossible to ignore. The Weimar government, fragile from the start, tried to navigate the pressures of reparations, inflation, and public anger. Some Germans accepted the treaty as an unavoidable consequence of defeat. Others saw it as an injustice that demanded redress. The resentment did not erupt all at once. It gathered slowly, like storm clouds forming on a distant horizon. It settled into conversations, into newspapers, into the quiet frustrations of daily life. The treaty had ended the fighting, but it had not ended the bitterness. In France, the mood was more cautious than triumphant. The war had been fought on French soil, and the memory of invasion remained vivid. The treaty offered a sense of security, but it also carried a lingering fear. The fear that Germany might one day recover its strength and return with renewed aggression. French leaders spoke of vigilance, of the need to enforce the treaty's terms, of the importance of maintaining a balance of power that would protect the nation from future threats. Yet even in France, where the desire for safety was strongest, there were voices that wondered whether the treaty's severity might create the very danger it sought to prevent. They worried that a humiliated Germany might become unpredictable, that economic hardship might fuel extremism, that the peace might prove too brittle to endure. The treaty had provided protection, but it had also planted seeds of uncertainty. In Britain, the reaction was more measured. The country had suffered greatly, but its homeland had not been invaded. Its cities still stood. Its industries still functioned. Many Britons viewed the treaty as necessary, but not entirely satisfying. Some believed it was too harsh. Others believed it was too lenient. Still others believed it was simply too complex to predict its long-term consequences. The British government, balancing public opinion with geopolitical concerns, adopted a cautious stance. They supported the treaty, but they also recognized that Europe's stability depended on Germany's recovery. A broken Germany, they feared, might destabilize the entire continent. The treaty had created peace, but it had also created fragility. Beyond Europe, The world watched the unfolding consequences with a mixture of curiosity and concern. The League of Nations, born from Wilson's vision, began its work with earnest optimism. Delegates gathered in Geneva to discuss disputes, mediate conflicts, and promote cooperation. Their efforts were sincere, and their hopes were high. Yet the League's authority was limited, and its ability to enforce its decisions depended on the willingness of nations to act collectively. Without the United States, the League lacked a crucial pillar, a source of strength and legitimacy that might have steadied it in moments of crisis. The absence was felt immediately, not in dramatic failures, but in subtle hesitations, in the quiet recognition that the world's most powerful nation had chosen to stand apart from the very institution it had inspired. The League existed, but it existed with a missing piece. As the 1920s unfolded, the world entered a period of uneasy calm. Economies recovered. Cities rebuilt. International conferences were held to address lingering issues. Diplomats spoke of cooperation, of reconciliation, of the possibility that the horrors of the Great War might never be repeated. And for a time, it seemed possible. The world felt lighter. The future felt open. But beneath that optimism, the deeper tensions remained unresolved. The treaty had rearranged borders, but it had not resolved the rivalries beneath them. It had punished Germany, but it had not reconciled Europe. It had created new nations, but it had not given them the stability they needed to thrive. 1. It had established the League, but it had not given it the power to enforce its ideals. The peace was real, but it was incomplete. In the end, the Treaty of Versailles was not the final chapter of the Great War. It was the beginning of a long and complicated aftermath, an aftermath shaped by hope, by fear, by ambition, and by the quiet, persistent desire for a world that could learn from its own suffering. The treaty had ended the fighting, but the peace it created required care, patience, and wisdom. It required cooperation, humility, and a willingness to see beyond the immediate relief of war's end and into the deeper currents that shaped the future. And as the world moved forward, slowly and uncertainly, it carried with it the recognition that the peace of 1919 was not a conclusion, but a fragile beginning, one that would be tested again and again in the years to come. In the months after the Senate rejected the Treaty of Versailles, the atmosphere in Washington took on a muted, almost dreamlike quality. The Capitol moved through its routines, the clatter of carriage wheels on Pennsylvania Avenue, the steady hum of typewriters in government offices, the soft rustle of papers carried through marble corridors. Yet beneath that familiar rhythm lay a quiet sense of unfinished business. The war had ended. The treaty had been signed, but the peace, the true peace Wilson had envisioned, remained just out of reach, like a distant shoreline glimpsed through fog. Woodrow Wilson, once the most admired statesman in the world, now found himself confined to the White House, weakened by the stroke that had struck him down in the autumn of 1919. His days unfolded slowly, marked by long periods of rest, brief meetings, and the steady presence of his wife, Edith, who became both guardian and gatekeeper. The president's mind remained sharp, but his body no longer obeyed him with the ease it once had. He moved carefully, spoke softly, and carried the weight of disappointment with a dignity that was both inspiring and heartbreaking. The world outside continued to turn, but Wilson's world had narrowed to a few rooms, a few trusted voices, and the lingering hope that the treaty and the League of Nations might still find a path forward. The White House, usually a place of bustling activity, grew quieter during these months. Curtains filtered the afternoon light into soft, muted tones. Footsteps in the hallways were measured, respectful, almost reverent. Visitors were screened carefully, their conversations kept brief to avoid exhausting the president. The atmosphere felt suspended, as though time itself had slowed to match Wilson's fragile pace. Yet even in this stillness, Wilson's determination remained unbroken. He believed the League of Nations was essential. He believed the world needed a structure to prevent future wars. He believed the United States had a moral obligation to lead. And so, from his quiet rooms, he continued the struggle, not with speeches or cross-country tours, but with letters, conversations, and the unwavering conviction that history would vindicate his vision. Outside the White House, the political landscape was shifting. The Senate remained divided, its factions entrenched in their positions. Some senators supported the treaty with reservations. Others opposed it entirely. A smaller group, loyal to Wilson's ideals, refused to accept any changes. The divisions were deep, and the president's absence from the public stage made compromise even more elusive. Henry Cabot Lodge, still chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, continued to press for his reservations. He believed the treaty, as written, threatened American sovereignty. He believed the League's obligations were too broad, too binding, too risky. And he believed the Senate had a duty to assert its constitutional authority. The two men, Wilson and Lodge, remained locked in a struggle that had become as much personal as political. Their rivalry, once merely philosophical, had hardened into something immovable, a stalemate that neither could break. As winter settled over Washington, Wilson's health fluctuated. Some days he seemed stronger, his voice steady, his thoughts clear. Other days he retreated into silence, his energy drained by the simplest tasks. Edith Wilson managed access to him with careful precision, shielding him from unnecessary stress while ensuring that essential matters reached his desk. Her role became so central that some observers later described her as a steward of the presidency, a description she neither embraced nor denied. Through it all, Wilson remained focused on the treaty. He read reports, dictated letters, and met with advisers in short, measured sessions. He refused to accept that the Senate's rejection was final. He refused to believe that the United States would abandon the League. He refused to surrender the vision that had carried him across the Atlantic and into the halls of Paris. In early 1920, as the presidential election approached, the treaty became a central issue in the national debate. Candidates spoke of it in speeches across the country, their words carried by newspapers and radio broadcasts to millions of Americans. Some argued that the United States must join the League to ensure global stability. Others insisted that the nation should avoid entangling alliances and focus on its own affairs. The public, weary from years of war and political turmoil, listened with a mixture of interest and fatigue. Many admired Wilson's ideals but questioned the practicality of his vision. Others believed the country needed a new direction, one that emphasized domestic concerns over international commitments. The election became a referendum on the treaty and on Wilson himself. When the results came in, the verdict was clear. Warren G. Harding, the Republican candidate, won by a landslide. He had campaigned on a promise of normalcy, a return to stability and simplicity after years of upheaval. His victory signaled the country's desire to step back from the world stage, at least for a time. For Wilson, the defeat was deeply painful. He had hoped the American people would embrace his vision. He had hoped the election would revive the treaty's prospects. He had hoped the League of Nations would become the cornerstone of a new international order. Instead, he watched from the quiet of the White House as the nation chose a different path. In the final months of his presidency, Wilson's world grew even smaller. He continued to advocate for the League, but his influence waned as the new administration prepared to take office. The Senate remained unmoved. The treaty remained unratified, and the League of Nations, though established, moved forward without the United States. Yet even in these final days, Wilson did not abandon hope. He believed history would judge the treaty differently. He believed future generations would understand the necessity of international cooperation. He believed the League, though imperfect, represented humanity's best chance to prevent another catastrophe. His conviction, though tested, never faltered. On March 4, 1921, Wilson left the White House for the last time as president. The day was cold, the sky a pale winter gray. Crowds gathered along the streets, watching as he rode to his new home on S Street. Some waved. Some stood in silence. Some simply watched, aware that they were witnessing the end of an era. Wilson, wrapped in a heavy coat, sat quietly in the car, his face composed, his eyes thoughtful. He had given everything he had, his energy, his health, his voice, to the cause of peace. And though the treaty had not been ratified, he believed the ideas behind it would endure. He believed the world would one day return to the vision he had carried to Paris. In the years that followed, Wilson lived a quiet life, writing, reflecting, and receiving visitors who sought his counsel. His health remained fragile, but his mind stayed sharp. He spoke often of the League, of the need for nations to work together, of the dangers of isolation. He believed the world would eventually learn what he had tried to teach. And in time, history would prove him right, though not in the way he had hoped, and not soon enough to prevent another global tragedy. But that part of the story belongs to another chapter. In the decades that followed the Treaty of Versailles, the world moved through a long twilight of memory and consequence, a period in which the echoes of 1919 continued to shape events in ways both visible and subtle. The treaty had been signed with ceremony and hope, but its legacy unfolded slowly, like a vast tapestry whose patterns only became clear when viewed from a distance. At first, the world believed it had stepped into a new era, one defined by diplomacy, cooperation, and the promise that the horrors of the Great War would never be repeated. Yet as time passed, the deeper currents beneath that optimism began to reveal themselves. The treaty had ended the fighting, but it had not ended the forces that had made the fighting possible. In Europe, the 1920s opened with a fragile sense of renewal. Cities rebuilt their streets and skylines. Factories resumed production. Families tried to reclaim the rhythms of ordinary life. There were moments, quiet, hopeful moments, when it seemed the continent might truly heal. Jazz drifted through cafes. Artists experimented with new forms. Writers tried to capture the strange mixture of relief and disillusionment that defined the post-war generation. The world felt modern, restless, alive. But beneath that surface energy, the treaty's unresolved tensions lingered like faint cracks beneath polished stone. Germany struggled under the weight of reparations and political instability. France remained vigilant, its sense of security tied to the treaty's enforcement. Britain balanced its desire for stability with concerns about the treaty's long-term consequences. And the new nations of Eastern Europe navigated borders that had been drawn with ambition but not always with precision. The peace held, but it held unevenly. The League of Nations, born from Wilson's vision, began its work with earnest determination. Delegates gathered in Geneva, their meetings filled with speeches about cooperation, arbitration, and the shared responsibility of nations. They mediated disputes, they oversaw mandates, and they promoted public health and labor standards. Their efforts were sincere, and at times even successful. Yet the League's authority was limited, and its ability to enforce its decisions depended on the willingness of nations to act collectively. Without the United States, the League lacked a crucial pillar, a source of strength and legitimacy that might have steadied it in moments of crisis. The absence was not immediately catastrophic. It was quieter than that, more like a missing note in a symphony, a subtle imbalance that only became noticeable when the music reached its most demanding passages. The League existed, but it existed with a hollow space at its center. As the 1930s approached, the world began to shift again. Economic turmoil swept across continents, shaking governments and unsettling societies. The Great Depression deepened existing tensions and created new ones. Nations turned inward, searching for stability in a time of uncertainty. Extremist movements gained traction, feeding on resentment, fear, and the belief that the treaty had been unjust or insufficient. Germany, in particular, became a focal point of this transformation. The economic strain, the political fragmentation, and the lingering humiliation of Versailles created fertile ground for radical voices. The treaty had been intended to secure peace, but in Germany it became a symbol of national grievance, a grievance that would be exploited with devastating effect. The world watched these developments with a mixture of concern and disbelief. Some hoped the tensions would ease. Others feared they would ignite. And a few, remembering the lessons of 1914, sensed that the peace created in 1919 was beginning to unravel. The treaty's legacy was no longer theoretical. It was becoming a lived reality. Yet even as the world drifted toward new dangers, the Treaty of Versailles remained a subject of debate, reflection, and reinterpretation. Scholars argued over its fairness. Politicians defended or condemned its terms. Citizens remembered the war that had preceded it and wondered whether the treaty had been too harsh, too lenient, or simply too ambitious for a world still recovering from trauma. Some believed the treaty had failed because it punished Germany too severely. Others believed it had failed because it did not punish Germany enough. Still others believed it had failed because it tried to impose peace without addressing the deeper forces that had driven nations to war. The truth, as always, was more complex, a mixture of intention, circumstance, and the unpredictable nature of human affairs. In the years after the Second World War, historians returned to Versailles with renewed interest. They examined the decisions made in Paris, the personalities that shaped them, and the political pressures that influenced every clause. They debated whether the treaty had caused the next war or merely failed to prevent it. They studied the League of Nations as a precursor to the United Nations, noting both its limitations and its innovations. And through this long process of reflection, a more nuanced understanding emerged. The Treaty of Versailles had not been a perfect peace, but it had been an earnest attempt to create one. It had been shaped by grief, by fear, by hope, by exhaustion, and by the belief, shared by millions, that the world could not endure another catastrophe like the one it had just survived. It had been crafted by men who were brilliant, flawed, determined, and constrained by the realities of their time. It had been both a product of its moment and a force that shaped the moments that followed. Its legacy was not a single story. It was a constellation of stories, some tragic, some hopeful, all intertwined. As the 20th century unfolded, the world continued to grapple with the questions raised in 1919. How should nations balance justice with mercy? How should peace be enforced? How should the grievances of the past be addressed without creating new grievances for the future? These questions did not end with Versailles. They continued to echo through international conferences, diplomatic negotiations, and the creation of new institutions designed to prevent war. The treaty had been a beginning, not an end. A foundation, not a conclusion. A reminder that peace is not a moment, but a responsibility. And so, when we look back at the Treaty of Versailles, across the decades, across the wars that followed, across the shifting landscape of global politics, we see not just a document, but a turning point. We see a world trying to rebuild itself after unimaginable destruction. We see leaders struggling to balance ideals with realities. We see nations searching for stability in a time of profound change. We see a peace that was imperfect, fragile, and incomplete, yet still a peace that mattered. In its ambition, in its failures, in its hopes, and in its consequences, the Treaty of Versailles became one of the defining moments of the modern world. It shaped the century that followed, not always in the ways its authors intended, but in ways that continue to influence us even now. And its legacy, like the echoes of the war that preceded it, remains with us, a reminder of the cost of conflict, the challenge of peace, and the enduring human desire to build a world where such treaties are no longer necessary.